About 4 or 5 to 1.
Call to order the February 6th, 2019 James City County Planning Commission meeting. Mr. Holt, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Dowdy.
Here.
Ms. Dowdy represents the Stonehouse District. Ms. Leverins.
Here.
Ms. Leverins is an at-large member. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. O'Connor.
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Mr. Croft.
Here.
Mr. Croft represents the Powhatan District, and Mr. Schmidt.
Here.
Mr. Schmidt represents the Roberts District and is this year's Vice Chair. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning for the county, and sitting to my left is Mr. Max Halabin, our Deputy County Attorney. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Before we move into the agenda, I'd just like to welcome our newest Planning Commissioner, Ms. Dowdy, representing the Stonehouse District. Welcome aboard, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Welcome. So we will move on now to the public comment period. This portion of the meeting is generally reserved for comments not related to the public hearings. We have 5 public hearings tonight, the public hearings coming up. That being said, or with that in mind, I want to add that this would be a good time to speak if you have anything related to the consideration portion coming up after the public hearings, a consideration item coming up later. Let's see, if we do have some speaker cards, and speakers are allotted 3 minutes for this portion, and when you come up to the podium, please state your name and your address. Our first speaker tonight will be Mr. Trant.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Tim Trant. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Kaufman & Knowles, with offices at 4801 Courthouse Street in James City County. I am here tonight at the public comment section to speak on behalf of Carter's Grove Associates, the owner of the 76-acre property that HRSD is proposing to condemn, as well as the adjacent property where the house and gardens are located. These 2 parcels comprise what is left of the historic Carter's Grove property. Our client bought the property to fulfill the county's and the community's vision for this national historic landmark, and has invested heavily in its preservation and restoration since his acquisition of the property. We are interested in working with HRSD on a mutually agreeable expansion plan, but under no circumstances can we support the proposal as it's been submitted, which would be to confiscate the entire 76-acre parcel. HRSD has indicated in their submittal materials that they only need approximately 6 to 7 acres in which to expand to implement the SWIFT pilot program, test well program. We believe there has been and can continue to be constructive dialogue between the parties towards a mutually agreeable resolution of their expansion needs. And we think endorsing the proposal to condemn all 76 acres would be counterproductive to that mutually agreeable dialogue or resolution and the constructive dialogue. The couple of things, 76 acres is about 10 times the amount of property that HRSD says that it needs, and it's crucial buffering for the Carter's Grove Historic Landmark. Ironically, HRSD claims that part of the reason that they need the acreage is for buffering and protection of their property, but we believe that's factually incorrect. Their site is highly stable. They have adequate property and easements across our property to protect their facility. Our ownership of the bulk of the property and the fact that it's in the AFD is all that's protecting the Carter's Grove historic landmark from some unreasonable intrusion. HRSD, as a condemning authority, can condemn conservation easements, and if they own the entire parcel, they can choose not to renew the AFD on that property in the future. So for all these reasons, we believe the proposal is inconsistent with the statutory criteria that staff has laid out in your staff report, and we would respectfully request that you endorse the recommendation of the AFD committee in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trent. We have one more speaker card. Mr. Everson.
Hi, Jay Everson, 103 Branscombe Boulevard in the Berkeley District, ably represented by Mr. Halderman. Last year I came here on the CIP regarding the schools, and I'm very happy at this point in time to say that everybody has finally agreed on how we're going to count our kids with the low enrollment projections. But I'm here to specifically to talk about the over $60 million proposed for the high school expansion and the new elementary school. I have provided you some material here. On Exhibit A, you will see that even at the low enrollment projections, which we've agreed on, they are overstating the number of children who are showing up. I know that the school board will tell you that within 1% year to year. That is true. Even though this year it was within 1%, but the number of students actually declined. If you take 1% and you put that over 5 years, you're up by 5%, as the numbers will indicate when the future becomes present. Now, the reason for this is on Exhibit C, which is the last page. Their methodology on the future think is a very key component of it is the number of building permits, multiplied by 2.94, which I believe is the average household size at this point. Unfortunately, as you will look on that, you will still see that colonial heritage is projected at 4% growth in student population. The number of students currently coming out of colonial heritage is 5 kids. Now this projection was 15% 3 years ago, 6% last year, it's 4 to 6% this year. The number of building permits coming out of there is a very huge number compared to the overall building permits issued by James City County. I would suggest that you might want to put in your report to the board on the CIP that our planning department do the enrollment projections, not future think, because they've been told repeatedly that they needed to fix this. Now, going on to the elementary schools, you will see on the Exhibit B that currently what they're doing is they've added Bright Beginnings, which is about 360 kids, into their projections. It is in no future think reports. This gives a shortage of space 10 years out of 37. There are some alternatives that cost a lot less than $38 million, and that would be to build 3 centers at $4.5 million, which is what the school board says it would cost, at 3 separate locations such as Matoka or elsewhere to accommodate 560 kids. The rest of the information you can follow through yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Everson. Now we move on to our... Oh, yep, thank you. Do we have anyone else who would like to speak during the public comment portion? Okay, seeing and hearing none, we will move on to reports of the commission. We have 2 reports, I believe, tonight, one from the Development Review Committee and one from the Policy Committee. Mr. Crawford presenting.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Development Review Committee met at 4 p.m. on January 23rd, 2019. Mr. Halderman, Mr. Polster, Mr. Schmidt, and I were present to review 2 conceptual plans. Conceptual Plan 18-0118-4704 Lady Slipper Offense. The applicant requested DRC approval to construct a fence within a scenic easement located at the rear of the property, which abuts John Tyler Highway. The easement is 75 feet wide and runs from the highway to the applicant's residence. The intent of scenic easements is not to have structures constructed in the easement area. At the time Grainland Woods was developed, which is where the applicant lives, there was no requirement for scenic easements to be owned by the HOA, but that is required today. Therefore, James City County owns the easement, which is why the DRC reviewed this particular case. The applicant proposes to build a 6-foot-tall wooden privacy fence that would be 8 feet closer to the house than the property line, resulting in a distance of 33 feet from the road. It should be noted that 3 adjacent properties also have wooden fences. The purpose of the fence is to reduce noise and provide a safe play area for pets. The DRC heard from the applicant and also looked at pictures of the neighboring fences when trees and shrubs were in bloom. The existing fences were not visible in the pictures, and the weathered wooden features blended well with the landscape in the absence of foliage. By a vote of 4-0, the DRC recommended approval of the application and associated conditions. In addition to the fence not being a visible intrusion in the scenic easement, DRC members felt that it was a significant safety enhancement from the busy traffic on John Tyler Highway. Next was Conceptual Plan 18-0124, 3889 News Road, the Village at Ford's Colony. This conceptual plan was submitted for a master plan amendment to case number Z-0008-2007, the Village at Ford's Colony, Section 37. The previously approved master plan contained 741 senior housing units, whereas this amended conceptual master plan shows a decrease to 550 units, consisting of 230 independent living cottages and townhouses, 80 independent living apartments, 60 assisted living beds, 40 memory care beds, and 40 skilled nursing beds. Total parcel size is approximately 180 acres, of which 41 are developable. Proposed density is 3.94 dwelling units per acre. The continuing care retirement community will not be a part of the Ford's Colony HOA. Mr. Bruce Hedrick of Retirement Unlimited Incorporator and Mr. Tim Trant gave a presentation to the DRC. During the discussion, DRC members requested the applicant to incorporate several items from the approved master plan into the amended master plan. These were continue to restrict the second entrance to emergency vehicles only in order to limit traffic on News Road, consider a green roof for buildings 1 and 2, earthcraft construction standards, and other environmentally friendly features, and incorporate watershed monitoring and protection. The applicant only requested feedback on the project, so no vote was taken. And that concludes my report, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Trout. And we have one more report this evening, Mr. Haldeman at the Policy Committee.
Thank you. The Policy Committee met at 4 p.m. on January 10th with Mr. Kropf, Ms. Leverance, Mr. O'Connor, and Mr. Richardson and I in attendance. Mr. Paul Holt continued the discussion initiated by the county supervisors about revising the process for handling residential developments that deviate from the master plan. Several committee members felt that the draft ordinance revision placed unfair burdens on developers, creating unintended consequences and risking the viability of the project. Staff will prepare 3 alternatives, including terms of the draft ordinance and one with a step that does not require a public hearing, for discussion with the supervisors at a joint work session on January 22nd. Ms. Tammy Rosario led a discussion about the comprehensive plan revision process that will begin with a survey of residents and the formation of the community participation team in the spring. To code requirements in the last plan, the Commonwealth has added projected sea level rise and recurrent flooding, consideration of broadband infrastructure, and groundwater and surface water availability, quality, and sustainability. Ms. Rosario also led an exercise to determine which topics, in addition to those previously submitted by the supervisors, the Planning Commission would like studied during the review process. The committee members' priorities were purchase and development rights, realignment of the PSA, the Economic Opportunity Zone, incorporating a public facilities master plan into the next strategic plan revision, and diversifying the county revenue sources. Other planning commissioners will also be surveyed. Ms. Tori Haynes led a tutorial on using the online CIP ranking system. Departments are preparing their requests, and packets will be ready by February. The meeting was adjourned at 6:20 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. Alderman. Great. Moving on to the consent agenda. The consent agenda items are typically deemed to be non-controversial. However, if a commissioner would like to pull an item for further discussion, we can do that. Tonight we have 3 items on the consent agenda. We have the minutes of the December 5th, 2018 meeting. Special thank you to staff for putting those minutes together. It was a long meeting. The minutes of the January 2nd, 2019 regular Planning Commission meeting. And we have the Development Review Committee action item that Mr. Kropp referenced, case number C-18-0118, which is 470804 Lady Slipper Fence. And if anyone wants to pull an item, we can do that. If not, may I have a motion?
Move approval of the consent agenda.
Oh, okay, so all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, for clarity of the minutes tonight, we're going to reflect that for the minutes of the previous meetings that Ms. Dowdy had abstained since she was not here for those, but register her vote in support of the agenda item.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. All right, I guess we're moving into the public hearings now. Tonight's first public hearing is SUP 18-0027, 121 Leisure Road, Luxterra Electric, Inc. And good evening, Mr. White.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman and members of the Commission. Mr. Cliff Martin has applied for an SUP to allow a contractor's office with equipment storage on behalf of Luxterra Electric, Inc. The parcel is located at 121 Leisure Road. The original owner had owned and operated this business since 1990. In order to bring the current operation into compliance, an SUP is required. Contractors' warehouses, sheds, and offices are specially permitted uses in the A1 district. The existing single-family dwelling on site is not part of the SUP and shall remain residential. Other existing structures on the property include a 2,600 square foot pole barn and a 2,800 square foot shop and a 1,600 square foot office. Currently, the business employs 9 full-time employees. Operating hours are between 6:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m., Monday through Saturday, with most employees just stopping by the shop in the morning or evening. Surrounding properties contain single-family residential dwellings. The parcel across the Leisure Road is currently undeveloped, agricultural, and forested, but is designated for future economic opportunity uses. The site is designated rural lands on the 2009 Comprehensive Plan land use map. Staff finds that the proposed commercial use does not fully meet the rural lands descriptive language of certain uses, which requires very low intensity settings relative to the site in which it is located. Staff finds this use slightly more intense than the surrounding properties. However, with the proposed SUP conditions, staff finds that it is unlikely that the proposed operation, particularly with parking of vehicles and storage of electrical contracting equipment located behind the residence, would visually impact either the right-of-way or adjacent properties. Therefore, staff finds the proposal to be compatible with the comprehensive plan, the zoning ordinance, and surrounding development. Staff recommends that the James City County Planning Commission recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the conditions listed in the staff report. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Also have my applicant, Mr. Martin, here, who can also answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. White. Yes, Ms. Leverance.
Were there any comments or objections from the neighbors?
No, I had just one call, and he just was curious about what was going on.
And Mr. Haldeman?
That was my question.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, thank you. At this point, I'd like to open up to my fellow commissioners. Does anyone have any disclosures they'd like to make before we open them? Okay. With that, we will open the public hearing, which is SUP 18-0027. Do I have any speakers cards? No speakers cards. Would the applicant or anyone from the public like to speak? All right, seeing and hearing none, I gavel down to close the public hearing, right? gaveling down, and we'll open up for discussion among the commissioners.
Mr. Chairman, I think since a previous use on this property was for a workshop and very similar to what the applicant's proposing, and the additional considerations for filling in any gaps in the buffer from the neighboring properties, as well as a stormwater management plan, I have no objections to this application and would support it.
Anyone else? Mr. Alden?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve or that we recommend to the Board of Supervisors SUP 18-0027.
And with conditions
conditions,
attached?
yes.
Okay. All right.
Ms. Leverins.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Crop.
Aye.
Ms. Dowdy.
Aye.
And Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
All right. Moving on to our next public hearing, SUP-18-0031, 115 Constance Lane. And good evening, Ms. Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the Commission. Ms. Kristen Baum of Guernsey Tingle has applied on behalf of homeowners Mr. and Mrs. Doug and Barbara Burris for a special use permit to allow a detached accessory apartment to be constructed within a new detached accessory structure at 115 Constance Avenue. The property is zoned R8, rural residential, is designated low-density residential on the comprehensive plan land use map, and is inside the PSA. The detached accessory structure will be 2,064 square feet, with the proposed apartment being 393 square feet. The accessory structure will also include a garage and workshop. The R8 zoning district allows detached accessory apartments as a specially permitted use in accordance with Section 2432B of the zoning ordinance. Staff has reviewed the proposed design and finds that all requirements have been met. Staff finds this proposal compatible with the surrounding development and consistent with the comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the proposed conditions. And at this time, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicant is also available.
Thank you, Ms. Haynes. Do any of the commissioners have any questions? All right. Thank you. All right. Again, any disclosures before we move into this case? All right, with that, I will open the public hearing, SUP-18-0031. Oh, yes, sir, please come forward and state your name and address.
My name is Doug Burris. I'm co-property owner of the said establishment with my wife, Barbara. And I first of all, thanks for the commission's time and the audience time, and in particular, Tori and Kristen, who helped put the packet together on this. I really appreciate their help, and I appreciate everyone's time this evening. There's one piece that I would like the commission to consider above and beyond what's in the packet. I understand the standard approval, if approved, is for a 24-month period. I do ask the commission to give me an extension of 12 months beyond the standard 24 for the purposes of my wife and I are kind of self-contracting this thing, and we don't know what we don't know, so we would appreciate as much time as could be afforded for us to get this thing done right so we don't run out of time before the required occupancy date. I'd ask you to consider that. It just gives us flexibility in learning and planning and executing this thing right. So with that said, if 24 months is the best we can do, then we're going to be okay with that. We'll make it right. We'll reshuffle some priorities that we have planned for the next 36, 48 months, but we can do that. But it sure would be helpful if we could have the 36 months, which I understand is about the max that we could request versus the standard 24. So if there's any questions or you need to understand any further rationale, I'm here to explain that.
If anyone would like to ask a question, that would just be...
The 36 months falls into your time frame, is that correct?
Actually, I was expecting longer, but I found out here recently that the standard is 24, so that's my bad. That gets to the you don't know what you don't know. So I learned that recently. I'm sure they tried to coach me otherwise, but it didn't sink in. So I'll make 36 fit, and 24 is even tougher, but 36 would be better. That answer your question?
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. Would anyone else like to speak? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing and open it up for discussion. Mr. Polster?
Yeah, can you add some clarification to the extension if that's possible? What are the conditions? I mean, can we even do it?
You can. It would be part of your recommendation up to the board. Staff would not object to a 36-month. We wouldn't have any issues with that.
I support the application, and I'm quite comfortable with 36 months.
Move for approval of the application with the change, with the conditions and with the change to condition number 2 from within 24 months to within 36 months.
Great. All right. Motion on the floor.
Ms. Leverins.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Crow. Ms. Dowdy.
Aye.
And Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Okay, moving on to our next public hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you. SUP-18-0032, 3020 Ironbound Road, rental of rooms, and good evening again, Ms. Haynes.
Thank you. Mr. Ryan Newsom has applied for a special use permit to allow the short-term rental of up to 2 bedrooms in an owner-occupied single-family home at 3020 Ironbound Road. The property is zoned R8, rural residential, is designated low-density residential on the comprehensive plan land use map, and is inside the PSA. The owner and his family will continue to reside in the home and will be present at the time of rentals. Short-term rental tenants will use an existing parking area located on the southern end of the property. No changes to the home's footprint are proposed. Staff considered the home's location, parking provisions, and screening all to be favorable factors in the evaluation of this application. The property is located near 2 tourist homes that were approved in 2018 by the Board of Supervisors. Staff notes that unlike a tourist home use, the rental of rooms limits rentals to a maximum of 3 bedrooms and requires the homeowners to continue residing at the property during the time of rental. Staff is recommending conditions which are intended to mitigate the impacts of the use and preserve the residential character of the home. Such conditions include limitations on the number of rooms rented and total number of rental occupants per stay. Staff finds the proposal to be compatible with the comprehensive plan, zoning ordinance, and surrounding development, and recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application subject to the proposed conditions. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicant is also available. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walter?
When I looked at the property, it looks like there are 2 driveway entrances to the property. Is that correct?
Correct. So there was the original home with an original driveway on the southern end, and then a larger driveway on the northern end. And the southern driveway would be, has been flagged for the rental occupants to use.
And I can't tell if there's adequate parking for the number of cars that are there. Is that true?
Yes, there is.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right. I guess disclosures? No disclosures. We're going to go ahead and open the public hearing, SUP-18-0032. Again, I do not have any speaker cards. Would the applicant or anyone else like to speak tonight on this? Okay, seeing and hearing no one. Whoops. Be more firm there. I'd like to go ahead and open it up for discussion. So closing the public hearing, opening up for discussion. I think I just want to say on this one that it's interesting. We've seen a pattern along this very same stretch of road. This is the third in as many months, and I just applaud the applicant here coming forward and going through the proper steps through the legislative process. So I like what I see here.
I agree with you that there's already been 2 approvals, and this use is actually a little less intense than the previous 2 for that were approved by the board. So I would make a motion to approve SUP 18-0032 and the conditions.
Thank you.
Leverins.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Kropf.
Aye.
Ms. Dowdy.
Aye.
And Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Right, moving right along to our next public hearing, Z-19-0001, Powhatan Terrace Proffer Amendment, Once again, good evening, Ms.
Thank you,
Haynes.
Mr. Vice Chair, members of the commission. Mr. Tom Tingle of Guernsey Tingle has submitted a request on behalf of Housing Partnerships to amend condition number 19 of the adopted proffers for Powhatan Terrace. This development was approved by the Board of Supervisors on March 28, 2008 as a cluster development consisting of 36 townhome units. At that time, all units were intended to be offered for sale. An amendment to condition number 1 of the original proffers was adopted on January 9, 2018, which allowed the development the ability to offer units for rent. Per the applicant, Powhatan Terrace is being developed with the use of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC program, an affordable housing tax credit program administered by the Virginia Housing Development Authority that focuses on rental housing. Currently, condition number 19 requires at least 3 affordable units to be offered for sale. The applicant has determined that having 3 units for sale could disqualify the project from the LIHTC program, and therefore has requested to revise this condition to instead require at least 3 affordable rental units with rates at or below 60% of average median income, with annual verification of rental rates to the planning director for 15 years. Staff notes that the amended proffer by itself doesn't fully satisfy the housing opportunities policy. However, as the amended proffer binds the owner to the requirements of LIHTC, staff found that the combination of the voluntary amended proffer and inclusion in LIHTC better satisfies the intent of the HOP than the original proffer. Staff finds the proposal to be compatible with surrounding development and consistent with the adopted comprehensive plan regarding affordable housing. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application and acceptance of the amended proffers to the Board of Supervisors. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicants are also available.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Leverns.
The concerns with the letter that we just received about the deep ravine, were those raised in either of the previous public hearings on this?
I'm not sure if the ravine itself was raised. I don't know to what detail that was discussed, but I do know that there is an environmental mitigation proffer, and then any of the current policies and regulations that have been updated since then would apply.
Okay, so if there's new information about potential flooding, that would be factored in.
Right. If there's new regulations, they would be held to those.
I think the point that we got out of this is sea level rise has been impacting that neighborhood, specifically landfall adjacent. This parcel that we're talking about, marshland, as you get sea level rise, about in this entire area, that I think this letter was really. So it becomes the issue of the siting of the apartment building more than anything else, as opposed to having it on the site. Now, the question for me is whether or not the site plan for this will go through a legislative process for us to be able to look at that implication.
The site plan is currently submitted and can be approved administratively, but once again, any proffers that would, any environmental proffers would have to be satisfied, any current regulations would have to be satisfied, and as of now in this early draft, none of the development is in any of the zones that were outlined in the master plan as being sensitive, or environmentally sensitive areas.
So are you telling me we're going to see this again in another legislative process?
The site plan, no. But it will be held to the proffers that were approved.
The condition is for 15 years. Why wouldn't it be 30?
I'll defer to the applicant for the proffer that they volunteered.
I had thought the VHDA required 30 years for their approval of these tax credits, but.
Right, and so LIHTC does, it's our understanding that LIHTC does compel the owner to commit to a 30-year affordability time period. The proffer obligates reporting to the Director of Planning for 15 years. So once again, it's the proffer itself, but combined with the LIHTC program that brings it closer to satisfying the HOP, and the LIHTC will keep it at the 30-year period.
Oh, okay, so it will be for 30 years then.
Yes.
Gotcha, thanks.
For LIHTC.
But the condition still is 15 years. That's the thing that really puzzles me about it. And the LIHTC document says 30 years. And so why doesn't the condition say 30 years as opposed to 15?
Yeah.
That's a question I raised before to staff.
Yeah, maybe we can get a chance to ask the applicant.
Okay. I mean, I'd like to see that. So, I mean, the point is that we don't have a HOP. And saying that we're going to confirm to a HOP when it doesn't exist doesn't hold anything for me.
What HOP is for the.
I'm sorry, the Housing Opportunity Policy, which was pulled by the Board of Supervisors. So, I mean, I'd rather stay with the condition when we finally get to that discussion of 30 years, not 15.
Are the, just a couple more questions, if I might. The original conditions dating to 2008, I think, are they still in force other than 19?
Yes, and 19 would still be enforced if the amendment's not approved.
Right. The condition number 2 of the 2008 conditions is the establishment of an owners association, but this is going to be all rentals.
So
how does that work?
Right. Had a brief feedback from the county attorney's office, and we'll definitely need some more insight there. But for the most part, staff is pretty convinced that they can meet that proffer in other ways. The owner himself can form the association.
It's an important condition because it's finances, maintenance, and the BMP and so forth. And if that fails, that'll come back to the taxpayers, I assume. Just wanted to be comfortable with that. That's all. I'm basically okay with changing the condition. But I was just curious how a homeowners association worked with renters and what assurance we might have that the financial obligations are going to be met. And then also there were cash proffers in condition number 4. Have they been paid, or will they? Are they the same, I guess?
Cash proffers are the same, having been adjusted for inflation this year. Cash proffers are paid after the final inspection and prior to CO, so that will stand per unit.
And finally, to condition or to continue the prior 2 comments, I met with the 2 authors of the letter that we've all received. They both own property immediately adjacent to this. And I walked the property, and the ravine is quite deep. And the stream analysis that called this an intermittent stream is dated 2004, I believe. And there was plenty of water in the bottom of that ravine when I saw it. And I've heard anecdotally that the ravine is widening and deepening year by year, so that when you do get to the site plan, assuming this is approved, something that really needs to be considered. The land topography on the north side of Jamestown Road, the opposite side, is steeply elevated, so that gravity is going to play a role in water flow across this property too. And it's just looks vulnerable to me to flooding and instability. So I just ask staff to keep that in mind. I know you will anyway, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Haynes.
Thank you.
All right, with that, do we have any disclosures among the commissioners? I guess.
I think I just made.
Yeah, you just made yours. I spoke briefly in passing to Mr. Frank, who's involved in this. Nothing substantial, though. Okay, all right, with that, we will open the public hearing for Z-19-001. Mr. Tingle, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice Chair, members of the Planning Commission, I'm Tom Tingle, President of Guernsey Tingle Architects, and here proudly representing housing partnerships on this project. And I'll try to answer some of the questions that you have. I really don't have any prepared remarks other than to say I'm not here to present architectural renderings that you normally see from us. Those were designed about 10 years ago as part of the original rezoning. With me tonight, we've got Brandy Weiler, who is our Executive Director for Housing Partnerships, our Board Chair, Curtis Baker, and board members, Andy Frank and Steve Romeo. And I'm going to ask Steve to come up in a few minutes and maybe address some of the drainage and environmental issues. We've got kind of a unique position here that we were involved in this project when it was originally designed and rezoned. It was designed, as Tori said, as a market rate market rate for sale housing. And the only affordable units that were in there were the three that we're talking about tonight. So really the Proffer amendment is just addressing those three units. Fast forward to 2016, we had a former board member by the name of Sterling Nichols, been involved in James City County for many years, who came into ownership of the property, approached housing partnerships with an opportunity to sell us the property, to give us a major donation, and that's what started this process moving. Thanks to the Planning Commission a little over a year ago and board action at the beginning of this past year, we were able to apply for the low-income housing tax credit, allowing the project to be rental as opposed to being for sale. And really the opportunity that Housing Partnerships has, that James City County has, is to put a significant affordable housing project in the county. It's only 36 units, so it's not a major impact on the neighborhood, but we are targeting 40, 50, and 60% of AMI for the rentals. And to give you an idea, our current rental projection is 1 bedrooms ranging from $485 a month to 3 bedrooms ranging up to $960 a month. So obviously significant rents below the market rate. The proffer that is in front of you tonight is the revision is for one reason. We found that in the application process for the low-income housing tax credits, it simply was a non-starter. The 3 units that are for sale do not qualify for the program. Housing Partnerships would actually have to transfer the ownership into a separate entity. We would have to subdivide those units out. We would have to finance them through a separate entity. And frankly, as we started looking at the viability of those units, if we were to build them for sale, we think that we would have difficulty with potential buyers that those units would be targeted to get financing for it. Conventional financing typically would discourage ownership in a development that has a significant amount of rental. Clearly, with 33 units that are rented and only 3 that are sold, we think we may have units that would be sitting out there for a while unless they could be owner financed. So for all of those reasons, as we go forward with the low-income housing tax program, we have asked to change that proffer. The 15 years was offered as the initial part of the low-income housing tax credit program. You're right, it's 15 and 30 years is the commitment that you make on it. Housing Partnerships, or the entity that will own the property, the LLC, has to make that commitment that it will be there for 15 plus years. We felt 15 years was the initial period of the program, which was a lot more than the original proffer had indicated. Effectively, if that unit was sold, there was no clawback that the county had to keep that unit affordable after the first sale. So we felt like the initial period of the program was adequate to give the county much more protection that the units would in fact be affordable. So we think it's a great project, a great opportunity for the county. Frankly, what we're asking for tonight is not a modification to the original site plan, a modification to the original master plan, but simply a modification to this one proffer that would allow us to continue with the application process with VHDA. So I would ask Steve, if he's still standing behind me, to maybe answer some of the questions. We are not aware of the letter that you got, that you received, have not seen that relative to drainage. One comment I will make is if you look at the plan that's on the screen now, the rectangle that's up close to Jamestown Road is effectively where our project is. And the back of the project, of course, goes back to the Powhatan Creek area, and you see in the rear of the property. But Steve can probably address drainage a little more specifically.
Sure. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Steve Romeo, VHB 351 McLaws Circle, James City County. I've been a board member for HPI for almost 20 years. Tom and I share a lot of HPI history. And my firm is preparing the site plan for this, or has submitted the site plan for this. The property has a very distinct scarp in its topography. Half of the property is not developable. It's a very flat plateau, and then it drops off dramatically into the floodplain that is adjacent to Powhatan Creek main stem. So all of that lowland is protected. I suspect that our elevation difference between the floodplain and where our lowest apartment units are has got to be pushing 20 feet. So the risk of flooding is non-existent, literally. We are surrounded by development from years and years ago that discharges their drainage uncontrolled into our property through the natural ravine system, and years of uncontrolled drainage result in the further incising of the ravines. We've taken that into account in our design. We'll be remediating that, and all of that stormwater will be controlled before it's discharged into Powhatan Creek. And those are the rules that we have to play by.
I would just ask you that I had no information as to where you were going to site it, and your clarification was very helpful. So what I'm hearing is that the red square there, or rectangle, is approximately the site for these 36 apartments?
Actually, if you look at the property that is labeled Shabui Woods,
right.
Our development really does not extend past, much past where that property is developed. So it's about somewhere between a third and a half of our property is developable. And the rest of it, it's a significant slope down to the floodplain for Powhatan Creek.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Romeo. Do we have any other questions for Mr. Tingle and Mr. Romeo? All right, thank you for speaking. Oh, sorry.
If I could, just
Mr. O'Connor.
Since you didn't have the benefit of the letter, it was questioning whether or not the homes would be built on slabs versus crawl spaces, you know, in the event that it was ever to flood. I think that was a big part of it, plus the conditions that Mr. Polster talked about prior.
They will be on slabs, and primarily because of accessibility concerns. I think most of our target, or a goodly portion of our target market, is going to be accessible challenged. So, you know, I think we do have a number of the units are going to be specifically constructed for to accommodate accessibility, but it doesn't make sense for us to do part of the project in slab and part of the project in crawl space because of the small size and the economy of the construction that we're looking at. The cost points are very sensitive to make the project successful.
Thank you very much. And we didn't have any speaker cards. Would anyone else like to speak at this public hearing? All right, seeing and hearing no one, we will move forward with discussion among the commissioners. Mr. Polster.
I think the clarification that the applicant has made in terms of where the site is going to be takes care of a lot of my concerns on the back half of that property. I'm still not a little puzzled over this 15-year condition versus the 30-year. I mean, I know, in fact, we had one that the board approved that actually moved it from 30 to 50, and part of it is to prevent the property rolling over to something more than into the market rate as opposed to this AMI, and I don't think that they intend to do that, but I'd like to see that we put that condition of 30 versus the 15. I am very, very, very supportive of this activity and what they're trying to do in terms of affordable housing. So I will support it, but I would like to see that condition.
Thank you, Mr. Polster.
And just a little bit of a procedural reminder, too, for what it's worth, whether Mr. Polster's comments were just thinking out loud, or part of the record. As a voluntary proffer, we cannot attach conditions to this. We have to be able to, the commission has to vote on the application as proposed. But certainly that thought process could be taken back by the applicant. But again, since this is not an SUP, you don't have the ability to attach conditions or make those types of recommendations to the board. You would need to vote on the application as proposed.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Right, well, I just want to throw in there, my father-in-law volunteered with Housing Partnerships for several years, and y'all do great work and are a big asset for our community. And I am supportive of this proffer amendment, as it will keep you hopefully in the LIHTC program status. So. Ms. Leverance.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move approval, recommend approval of JCC Z-19-001 Powhatan Terrace Proffer Amendment.
Thank you. Motion on the floor.
Ms. Leverance.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Croft.
Aye.
Ms. Dowdy.
Aye.
And Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. Moving on to our last public hearing of the night, SUP-18-0030-6446 Richmond Road, convenience store with gas pumps, and it's a Wawa. And good evening, Mr. Brook.
Good evening. A little reprieve from Tori for a moment.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the Commission. Mr. Tim Tran of Kaufman and Knowles has applied for a special use permit to allow for the construction of a convenience store and gas station which sells and dispenses fuel. The parcel is located at the corner of Lightfoot Road and Richmond Road, across from the Lightfoot Shopping Center redevelopment. The site is currently used as an Exxon gas station with convenience store. The parcels are zoned B1 general business and are designated mixed use by the 2035 comprehensive plan. A convenience store which sells and dispenses fuel is especially permitted use in the B1 zoning district. The parcel is split by the James City County and York County jurisdictional line, with the entrance from Richmond Road in James City County and one of the proposed gas pumps and a portion of the canopy in James City County as well. The site is within a community character corridor and entryway into the county. Staff does not find that the visual impacts from the proposed development to this entry corridor have been mitigated through enhanced architectural design, signage, and landscaping requirements that have been approved by the Board of Supervisors in previous applications along community character corridors. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend denial of this application to the Board of Supervisors due to the visual impacts on the entry corridor that have not been mitigated. Should the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors, staff recommends that the conditions listed in Attachment 2 be applied. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicant is also available. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Levens.
It could be seen from distance as the tail wagging the dog here with us trying to impose our community character corridor aesthetic requirements. But can you explain to me why it is that we can do this?
So the previous approved canopies and gas stations around the county, and the board approved design of those canopies and the higher standards that are set by the comprehensive plan for community character corridors, have us looking at the development as a whole. And it is, in staff's opinion, that those pieces of the development have not been mitigated and are a concern.
And as I understand it, because there is an entrance onto Richmond Road, the county basically has a say-so. I mean, if there were no entrance onto Richmond Road, we would have less say-so, perhaps, if they didn't.
Not necessarily. The property that's within James City County, if it's being used for the use overall on the property, which is the gas station and convenience store, that's where the specially permitted use comes into play. So we would still be hearing this application if there were no entrance.
And Ms. Leverins and members of the commission, to be clear, the James City County side of the line, we can't write conditions that would bind anything in York County. It's in a different jurisdiction. So, you know, in terms of the SUP conditions, they can only be written for this triangle,
But
as
it's
you see here.
unreasonable to expect that they have one kind of canopy up to the last 3 feet and then a different kind of canopy for the last 3 feet.
Mr. Haldeman.
You sent us an email late this morning with revised, pardon me, sign and landscape plans. Does that not make you feel better about this project, or is it still not up to James City County standards?
There's still aspects of both the sign and the landscaping that don't meet the James City County ordinance. For example, the digital nature of the sign would not be allowed in James City County, and the second aspect of the landscaping along the portion of the property next to the Hardys is over the 90 feet between landscaping bays. We were happy to see that the York County ordinance does require the building adjacent to building landscaping, and the applicant added that to the plan.
There's a digital sign there now, right on the corner, and it's a good deal higher than the one proposed here, I think. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cross. Just a couple questions. It seems like the three major bones of contention are the canopy design, the LED sign, and the 90-foot, the landscaping issue. And the York County Planning Commission has already recommended approval of this case, and it's moving forward through their legislative process. I guess taking it back a couple steps, were there any meetings between our staff and York County and the applicant early in this process to discuss whether or not these three, what seem to be relatively minor issues, could be resolved with the agreement of the applicant and then move forward to us?
There were many meetings between James City County and York County throughout the beginning portion of the process and middle portion of the process, leading up to even the last couple of days, talking back and forth in the last week. These points have remained issues where James City County ordinance just simply is a higher requirement than the York County ordinance, and York County had the opinion that this canopy style and the digital signs are approved in other portions of York County, and didn't think that it would be didn't want to add those conditions to the case, even with our vocalization of those concerns.
Thank you.
And it's unique indeed. I mean, those items, the sign specifically, and that portion of landscaping is on the York County side. Certainly as part of the staff report, staff felt that those should be mentioned, especially the disconnect with the sign that wouldn't be allowed on James City County side. But again, really the only one that you're able to really ultimately affect through a condition would be that portion of the canopy that's on the James City County side. And again, part of staff's recommendation anyway is to acknowledge that that design is not consistent with what the board had approved on the two most recent cases, including the one across the street. So
in Lightfoot Marketplace.
Correct, and we thought that was a very relevant factor for you all's consideration.
I'm still a little fuzzy on the landscaping issue, because they thought one of it was the piece next to the Hardys, but the other one was the corridor 50-foot piece. Is that still a concern?
I'm sorry, that is still a concern. It's only 45 feet along the Greenway, which is what York County has the requirement from the right-of-way to, into the site. So it is 45 as opposed to 50.
Ms. Leverins?
Sorry to spring this question on you, but it just occurred to me. What's different between this digital sign and the two digital signs that exist at Five Forks?
I don't have an answer to that question.
Because we do
I'm
have
not
a
sure.
precedent for digital signs in James City County at Five Forks. There are two of them. Beg pardon?
Character quote.
Well,
I mean,
Five
to the
Forks is
degree
also a
that
sensitive area.
they're out there, they're non-conforming. They're not allowed they're either illegal or they're more than likely non-conforming. The current ordinance does not allow them.
My understanding was Mary Jones actually contacted because the first one was installed illegally. And then when somehow it got through the system, then the one across the street installed one.
There was a point in time when those were permitted by the ordinance, but the ordinance does not currently permit
Okay,
them.
so the ordinance changed.
Yes.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, any further questions? Mr. Witt?
And I don't know if this is for you or for Mr. Holt, but when we talk about impacts on traffic in this area, does it matter, with Lightfoot Road lying in York County and Richmond Road in James City County, you know, are we only supposed to consider impacts on Richmond Road, or can we consider impacts on Lightfoot and the intersection altogether?
The traffic study considered everything together, because certainly to the degree that the traffic doesn't work on Lightfoot Road for whatever reason, all of that traffic would then need to be funneled out through the existing westernmost entrance on Richmond Road, which is on the James City County side. So you'll see an attempt in the SUP conditions to ensure, even though we can't require anything on the York County side, to tie those in, because again, the resulting impact, if for whatever reason the traffic study assumptions or the traffic study recommended improvements do not get implemented on Lightfoot Road, that will absolutely have a, would absolutely change with what happens there on Richmond Road.
And do we know, does VDOT have a time frame to install? Well, I understand it's installed with Lightfoot Marketplace, but the control for the stoplight, which is the left turn, if you're eastbound Richmond Road, left turn onto Lightfoot Road, the control for the railroad crossing, do you know if that's scheduled to be connected at any point?
I don't know that we have any information on that. Last time I had checked with VDOT, they had not identified any funding for that.
I guess I'll throw one in there. The York County's already approved all of what they're going to do on that.
Through the Planning Commission.
Their triangle. Okay, through the Planning Commission level. Okay,
Correct.
good to know. And did they approve the multi-purpose path on Lightfoot?
They did approve the multi-purpose path. They have a separate process where in their zoning ordinance they allow a swapping of types of bike facility. So it showed on Lightfoot Road a bike path. They allowed the swap to a 10-foot multi-use path.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Grove.
With the traffic impact analysis, did that include the proposed apartment complex that's going in York County behind this? I think it did, but I wanted to make sure.
Yes. From what I understand, it did, yes.
I'm not sure about that. Not sure about that question at all.
Thinking that may not have been factored in.
Well, I went and looked, and so whether I asked him or I asked the applicant, I was going to wait to the applicant.
Yeah, it's just north of there. All right. So thank you, Mr. Brook. So we have a speaker card. And Mr. Trent. Good evening again. Oh, excuse me. I've got to open the public hearing. And before I do that, I have a quick disclosure, and some of you may as well. I did speak to Mr. Trent on the over the phone yesterday about this case.
I also spoke with him over the phone, just general parameters about the case and any changes since the staff report was written.
As did I.
I didn't talk with Mr. Trent, but we did get the email from him.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we will open the public hearing, SUP-18-0030. Mr. Trent.
Quick ticket. That may come in handy as the presentation gets. Good evening, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the Commission. Again, my name is Tim Trant, attorney with the law firm of Kaufman & Knowles, offices at 4801 Courthouse Street here in James City County. It's my privilege to be here today on behalf of Doswell Ventures, which is the owner of the property, as well as Wawa, the proposed site operator. With me today is Mr. Andy Sadler, an executive with Woodfin Oil Companies, which is the owner and an affiliate of Doswell Ventures, and the current operator of the Exxon convenience store there now. Mr. Jeb Bell in the audience, Director of Site Engineering for Wawa. Mr. Dan Caskey with Bay Companies is here, and Carl Hutgren, who may be on the hot seat for Mr. Polster, with Ramey Kemp and Associates, our traffic engineer, and a myriad of other real estate professionals in the office, Mr. Matt Laffler as well. And of course, you know, this is the project location. I won't dwell on these slides, but if in questions and comments we need to refer back to them, I just want you to know they're here. A little background on Doswell Ventures, headquartered in Richmond. Many of you will know the Woodfin Oil Company. This is one of their company-owned stores. They presently operate the Exxon gas station. As I mentioned, they acknowledge that it's an older facility in need of renovation and redevelopment for the convenience store gas station use. It's their intent, has been their intent to do that when they were given the opportunity to partner with Wawa, which they thought was a preferred choice for the redevelopment of the site. Many of you in the audience will know Wawa by your user experience. They're typically very attractive commercial locations, are well appointed architecturally, well landscaped, well lit, clean, well maintained. Full of fresh and prepared foods as you go inside. Many of you may notice, as I do, much to the guilt trip that it imposes on me, that you have to walk past the fresh and prepared foods to get to the junk food that I typically am purchasing at Wawa. But it's a really unique user experience, and they've sort of distinguished themselves in the convenience store marketplace. And there is so that's what most of you will probably already know about Wawa, but there's a corporate culture behind Wawa that is particularly interesting and contributes, I think, to that user experience. First of all, it's a family-owned business with almost 200 years of history. Started off in the iron foundry business, of all things, evolved to dairy farming in Pennsylvania, and opened their first food market in 1964 as an evolution of that business, the dairy business. They now have grown to approximately 800 stores and over 30,000 employees. Each store entails about a $5 million capital investment. These are expensive, well-built, well-designed stores, well-appointed facilities and properties, and will result in the hiring of about 30 to 40 new jobs. One thing that's unique about Wawa is these jobs, part-time and full-time, come with full benefits and tuition reimbursement. And another very, very unique factor in the Wawa corporate model is about 40% of Wawa is owned by its employees through an employee stock ownership program, commonly known as an ESOP program. So as an employee of Wawa, given your tenure, you accrue in your retirement account ownership of the company at 40% of the company. And they are noted as a community partner in the communities where they locate. A little bit about the project benefits. It's consistent with current zoning and the comprehensive plan. It's an aesthetic enhancement of the corridor, and it entails improved traffic and pedestrian planning. Try and get into the meat of some of the questions that you all ask in the email that I sent last night. So this is the conceptual site plan, as you can see here, and I have a number of versions of that. And the two triangles here are the portions of the property located in James City County. Sort of the grayed out area is the portion of the property located in York County. I will tell you and confess to you that this is the first application in my some 18 years of doing this that's been a split jurisdiction application. It has been a technical challenge for me and the team, both in terms of the land planning, but also in terms of just managing review, technical review by the reviewing agencies, by staff, the various staffs, and reviewing agencies, and managing also, of course, the review schedule and the public hearing process. But so bear with us if we haven't moved as effectively as we could have. It's been a learning curve. We did try as best we could as a land planning team to aggregate. It's a tight site. Let me back up. It's tight to try and fit all of these things in there. But we did try to aggregate our improvements as best we could in the larger area of the site on York County for ease of site plan review, building permits, and building inspections, so that there wasn't confusion during the construction phase were this to be approved about on which inspection you need from which locality and whatnot. But because of the site, the constraints of the size of the site, it did in the inability to slide the fuel canopy and the fueling positions any further sort of south, it did result in a corner of the fuel canopy being located in James City County. In any event, just a little background. These are sort of better visuals that sort of isolate what is being proposed in York County or in James City County. And I'll let Paul or Alex correct me where I'm go astray, but I believe that the objections to landscaping and community character and buffer landscape islands and parking fields and all relate to elements of the plan that are in York County. This is the landscape plan for the area, which is in James City County, and we do believe that it complies with all of James City County's requirements. And I may have missed details in comment letters, and I'm certainly as fallible as the next human being. But I will say, just in candor, I do not recall the two items in particular, the landscaping around the perimeter of the building and the landscaping between the parking islands being an issue that we had been attuned to before the staff report came out, but that may be of a detail we missed. There were some conversations that Mr. Brook mentioned where the county staff, planning staff, gave us a number of comments and feedback on the plan as it had been submitted on elements of the plan that were in York County, and we did try very hard to accommodate those through the process that I mentioned. I'll get to that. One of the things I'll say about Wawa, and acknowledge my bias, but Wawa considers itself sort of a high-end vendor of the convenience model, and they really pride themselves on that business model and that high-quality aesthetic. And they spend a lot of time with their architects and their site planners and their designers developing architectural features of their sites that they improve upon constantly, that they feel achieve sort of a high architectural standard. In particular, their model and their current architectural vision for their sites includes a stacked stone element where we now have brick, this dark colored brick. The original elevations included that stacked stone, which we think candidly is a better architectural feature. It creates a contrast in materials and color that is more architecturally and aesthetically pleasing. The county preferred the all brick facade and the two-tone brick in particular, so we yielded to that and changed the design to accommodate that. One other example of that was the ice box to the rear of the building. Wawa does not traditionally have a lot of outdoor display items. All of their merchandise is typically in the store. We had originally proposed an ice box out here. There's sort of design features what makes that problematic interior. We moved that to the rear of the building, as you can see in this revised elevation at the request of staff. And we also added a pedestrian connection from Richmond Road. So Alex had pointed out to us, while we had in our plan a pedestrian connection from Lightfoot Road, and a multi-use path, a 10-foot multi-use path down the Richmond Road frontage, we did not have a separate connection from Richmond Road to the store. So we added here along this portion of the property a sidewalk and pedestrian crossing from Richmond Road. So we made a number of concessions. The concession on the fuel canopy was one we appealed to staff not to make. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder, we acknowledge, and we also acknowledge that we are not the beholder in this case, that you and the Board of Supervisors are the beholder. But for what it's worth, Wawa is of the opinion that this canopy design, this monoplane canopy design, is architecturally less intrusive than the A-frame or gable canopy that staff has asked for. In fact, some of the examples that they cited were not, particularly the one across the street, are not A-frame. It's more of a mansard canopy. But in any event, fuel canopies generally are hard to make attractive. And Wawa believes that a higher elevated canopy with an earth tone roof and a white undercarriage and a monoplane that's sort of angled towards the flow of traffic like this, taken from a store on Route 17, makes the visual impact of the canopy less obtrusive, and it sort of opens the site up. People look through it. It's not as visually distinct. A larger mass, an A-frame canopy, a lower canopy is going to create a larger visual mass, obstruct the view of the brick building and the attractive facade, and just create more of a visual impact on the corridor that's less aesthetically pleasing. So it's our humble request that the commission endorse the canopy design that we've proposed. And this, I think these are, just go over quickly the differences in the conditions that I had sent to you all. I think I explained in the email the distinction in square footage. I'm not sure that maybe the 5,850 was pulled from an old plan, but the current footprint is estimated to be about a little over 6,000 square feet. So if technically this was for a building that's going to be in York County, but just for the sake of clarity, we asked for a little leeway there in terms of final design. On bicycle accommodations, we are proposing, in lieu of a shoulder bike lane, a 10-foot multi-use path. We believe that for this application in this location, given the turning movements and traffic on Richmond Road and Lightfoot Road, that a multi-use path is the more functional, more safe, and more practical application, and more likely to be extended down the line as adjacent properties redevelop. So we have proposed the 10-foot multi-use path in lieu of a shared bike lane, which we think is a better feature to implement the county's bikeway master plan. And then last, but gosh, I'm moving too quickly, fuel canopy, we just asked that the fuel canopy condition be revised to require that the canopy be consistent with that elevation, which we have submitted to the county as an on file with the county planning director. I am running to the near my time, and I've covered most of the points that I wanted to share with you all, but I'm happy to cut that off and start addressing your questions. I know there are many.
Thank you, Mr. Trent. Would anyone like to ask a question at this time?
I'll start off if that's okay. I'm trying to still understand the 50-foot setback. Is it 45 or 50?
Sure. I'll explain that. It's both. Bear with me. This is probably as good a representation as any. So this is a 50-foot setback in James City County.
Okay.
It does drop to 45 feet in York County. Let me explain why. That wasn't, well, we can grab 5 extra feet, we need to do it just because we can. The curb line actually will continue along that 50-foot setback, but it is such a tight site that and it was important to have the fuel tanks in one jurisdiction, not split between two for regulatory reasons. And they have to be in a certain proximity, the fueling islands, and I'm boring you with more details than you want, but the short of all that is there are standpipes that are associated with the fuel tanks. Those standpipes are above ground, and the pad for those standpipes are all in this region, which cut into gave us the flexibility to cut on the York County side to get 5 extra feet, which made the layout work.
Landscaping problem next to the Hardys?
I believe what Mr. Baroque is speaking of here is there are, in James City County, distinct from York, where you have 90 feet of parking field, or more than 90 feet of parking field, it needs to be interrupted by a landscape island. So I believe he is referring to this row of parking located in York County.
Okay.
Yeah, and also I believe, just in candor, I think the objection is also in front of the site, I guess. If you count, I haven't mentioned it, but I think he's of the opinion that there is 90 feet between the landscape islands here in front of the store that would be over some distance, 10 feet or so over the the James City County standard.
So my questions on the TIA really has to do with that left turn out on Lightfoot going north. And I understand that you're pushing the entry in, that pork chop, back towards the railroad tracks. And I noticed in the VDOT comments that in fact they may relook at that to in fact make it only a right out. Do I have that correct so far?
That is correct, yes. They, in order to, and maybe I'll back up to the beginning so you can see the current layout. Too far. In any event, so the current, probably an area will do us better. The current entrance off of Lightfoot Road is much closer to the intersection than what we're proposing. Yes, we are pushing it as far back as we can towards the railroad right away and still achieve, you know, the taper and right turn into the store. But it is still not far enough away from this intersection that it meets, you know, the standard for VDOT for access management. So we did have to apply for an access management exception for that entrance, and for that entrance location. And as a condition of that approval, VDOT did indicate that they reserve the right to eliminate the left out if in the future it proves to be problematic.
And that's what concerns me. And so I was trying to figure out what the, not your LOS rates, but then what those levels of service would be after your system was built. And as I look at the Lightfoot and the Richmond Road, it goes to EF. You're probably wondering where I got that from. I got that from the Moortown Traffic Corridor Study. And they did a not built and a built. And in the 2040 time frame on that, they had an EF on that. And on top of it, the number of vehicles per day at that time frame was 10,100. That condition. So when I looked at your current vehicle per day number, and I looked at the notion that we were going to put this apartment house in there with, how many folks are they going to, 240 apartments? They're going to put in restaurants, retail stores, business and that. And that's located right across the railroad tracks. And when I looked at that count of what that was adding, plus your own 8,800 and their 1,500, all of a sudden I was at 10,396 with the thing built at that time frame. Now, I may have my math wrong, but what I'm looking at is a cumulative impact on that road that was projected in 2040, but looks like by the time we finish this being built in 2023, for that time frame you're talking about at the latest, we've already exceeded it, and it's an EF at that intersection. So my concern is that that left-hand turn out is almost unacceptable given what we look at the vehicles per day on that road. And so I think we ought to be considering about not having that pork chop left out now. Now that's my concern. I can't do anything about it because you guys are in your county. But I know that we share that corridor, and that's a concern.
What I will say, Mr. Polster, and I'm going to ask Mr. Holtgren to come forward and to respond to your question as best he can. I do know that it was important to us, to VDOT, and to both localities in scoping the study that we incorporate into our background traffic assumptions, not only the development that you speak of, which was included, but also the changes to the Lightfoot Marketplace Plan that were recently approved by the Board of Supervisors in James City County. In particular, the Panera Bread and Harris Teeter fueling station and the Valvoline quick serve oil change. So that study, the apartment study, were all sort of built into our study in terms of our background traffic on top of the the traditional growth rate. And I'll let Carl sort of respond further to your question about, you know, what the, you know, the levels of service.
Thank you, Tim. Members of the commission, my name is Carl Holtgren with Ramey Kemp and Associates. We're a traffic engineering firm based in Raleigh. I manage our Richmond office, which is at 4343 Cox Road in Glen Allen. And Tim is exactly right. Just to clarify right off the bat, we did include the trip potential from the apartment community that was approved on the other side of the railroad tracks, as well as the expansion that's been approved at the Harris-Teeter side as well. To address your question about the 2040 corridor study that was done, that's outside the scope of our study. You know, we've worked very closely with staff and with VDOT, and you know, our task was to evaluate the build-out year of the Wawa, which was assumed to be 2020. So a corridor study for 2040 is 20 years beyond.
The corridor study had done in 2016. The projection I'm talking about is the 2040 built, if not built. And so that not being built, the Moortown was never done, but all that traffic from all of the Walmart, the Lowe's, the Home Depot, and everything else that's over there, traffic's down Moortown, makes a left-hand turn on the Lightfoot, and hits that. And so what those numbers talk about is what the 2040 of that traffic light without your 240 whatever for your house or even the marketplace. That was the projection for just that if it wasn't built. So we have this traffic that's going to be there, and it looks like the numbers that you're adding now bring us to the vehicles per day at what the 2040 projection was underneath that corridor study.
Mr. Polster, let's
Okay, I'm
let
sorry.
Mr. Hogan finish, and then you can ask him a question.
That's certainly possible. I think we're in agreement there. Now, the 2040 projections would also grow all the traffic on Richmond Road as well, which is much heavier than what we see on Lightfoot Road. So that's if you go traffic out far enough, yes, every intersection will go to E or F. So if we're going 20 years out in the future, you know, it's very possible that this intersection would go to E or F with no improvements. I don't know if the study you're talking about contemplated any improvements to the intersection, you know, additional turn lanes or widening. I haven't seen that study, so I can't speak to that.
And then within our own comp plan, when you look at the road from from Croker Road to the Lightfoot Richmond Road in that time frame, it still has it at EF. I mean, so it's a cumulative impact of the traffic impact, and all I'm concerned about is a left turn out.
Right.
Okay?
Understood.
I can't do anything about the rest of it.
Right. And to, I don't know if I can, let's go backward. And VDOT shares your concern about the left turn movements there, believe me.
Exactly, I know.
That's I was just trying to find the aerial. There's a couple more slides here. Yep, here we go. So, you know, and we've met, you know, collectively several times with Mr. Holt, with York County, and with VDOT to work all this out. And VDOT's, one of their prime concerns was the proximity of this full movement driveway to the signal and the problematic left turns. I mean, that's been clear from the very get-go. So as a result of those discussions, as Tim mentioned, we're sliding this driveway all the way back to here and removing the inbound left turn movement from Lightfoot Road, which has priority over the outbound left. So that'll make the outbound left a little bit easier. There'll be one less movement to contend with, basically. And VDOT made it clear to us that, and the design that we came up with has been approved conceptually by VDOT with the left in. And just like any other driveway on their system, they reserve the right to have a driveway modified, to take away movements if a particular movement is unsafe or problematic for some reason. So they can certainly do that in this case in the future. If the left out is not functioning well or creating a problem, then VDOT has the right to come back and modify that later. But they've agreed. You know, what we're showing is the result of many, many meetings with VDOT, and this is the configuration that we've collectively come up with.
Maybe what I would add to Mr. Polster, and let Carl disagree if he deems appropriate, but it has been my experience, and I have not as much credibility as Carl, but I was an engineer in a former life, and did transportation work. And the more access you have to a site, typically the more relief valves, the more opportunities for ingress and egress, typically the more efficient the traffic flow will be. And we would like to, and it's important to the economic model, to preserve as much of that efficiency as we can when it's not a problem, when it doesn't create conflicts with the network. So I feel like it's an appropriate compromise that we've committed to restricting only to the left out and acknowledging and accepting that VDOT will have the ability to close that if traffic conditions evolve over time and other improvements are not made to allow that left turn out to continue safely.
If I could just add a couple other points, just in case you're not aware, or for folks in the audience. There are two right-in, right-out driveways here on the James City side, and as part of the redevelopment, this driveway will be closed off completely, the one that's closer to the signal. So this one will remain right-in, right-out, sliding this driveway back like we've already talked about, and then two other improvements. The right turn lane here on Lightfoot Road approaching the traffic light will be extended as much as possible. I believe we're getting another 50 or 100 feet of storage there on that turn lane, and then tapering it back before we get to the railroad tracks. So with this plan, we're maximizing the storage on that right turn lane so more people can get through, and also extending the storage on this, I'll call it the eastbound or southbound left turn lane on Richmond Road, extending the storage back here in this left turn to better accommodate the left turn and U-turn movements as well. So overall, big picture, we're talking about several transportation improvements here to both minimize conflicts and increase storage capacity on critical movements. I just wanted to point those out for everybody.
Well, that's helpful, thank you. Mr. Constance?
Has there been discussion with VDOT? So if I'm eastbound Richmond Road, so my access to Wawa is to make a U-turn at that intersection.
Okay.
Correct?
Yes, sir. Without the left turn in from Lightfoot, then if you're coming from this direction, you would come up to the traffic signal, make a U-turn, and then right in back here.
Right. So in their conversations with VDOT, has there been discussion about making that a no right on red if you're southbound Lightfoot to go west on Richmond Road? Because currently there's a lot of U-turn traffic there. There's a lot of folks making right-hand turns coming from Lightfoot Road, and I suspect that we will see the U-turn traffic increase with the Wawa located there.
That's a safe bet that there'll be more U-turns in the future. We have not specifically talked about a no right turn on red condition.
And does your traffic analysis consider the number of times per day that the intersection is bottlenecked, to put it nicely, when there's a train rolling through?
No, sir. Our traffic model does not account for the effect of a train crossing. Just to clarify, the train crossing is not connected to the traffic signal here. So when a train is going through, it does not affect the signal.
Right.
The operation of the signal as it cycles.
But it affects the outflow of the Wawa if I'm trying to go out and go north on Lightfoot Road, because, right now,
right,
everybody's trying to make a left-hand turn onto Lightfoot Road coming east on Richmond Road, and half the time the intersection gets blocked, just with normal traffic patterns today without that signal.
I believe, Carl, a safety valve that's already in place for alternative movement that accomplishes the same directional flow, which is 199.
Right, but once you cross that intersection, there's no relief. You're jammed up the
understood. Yeah,
intersection.
once you're in it, you're stuck. Right. No, understood. But in terms of avoiding the conflicts and the flow of traffic, I mean, as somebody that commutes in that corridor pretty regularly, I make it a point. I've made a few mistakes in going Lightfoot Road, as I thought was a shortcut, only to find out it was a substantial long cut. And so I don't make that movement anymore. I continue on 199 and get off at Route 60. And so
just
there it is.
one other traffic question. In just real simple layman terms, and for the folks who might be watching, what do we expect the increase of traffic to be as customers to that site? So currently it's X number of customers going to Exxon, and in 2020 it's going to be Y number going to Wawa.
To put you on the hot seat, I do not know the answer to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you're looking for a specific number, it'll take me a moment. One thing to really remember here is that with the current use, the Exxon, and with Wawa, most of the customers are what we call pass-by trips. It's people who are already driving by the site today on Richmond or Lightfoot Road. By definition, this is a convenience store, so people are driving in and out of the store as a convenience. So a redevelopment like this, Wawa actually creates very few new trips on the road. Most of these Wawas and similar uses are busy. When they're built and up and running, you see a lot of people turning in and out of the driveways, but most of those people are already on the road today, and they're not new trips added to the network. Sure. Yeah, that may take me a minute to do the math.
Is that all right, Mr.
Any other questions? Sure. Okay, Mr. Crow.
Deviating from the traffic study for just a minute, one of the attachments in the package that was submitted had to do with the canopies, and there was a Wawa project in New Jersey, it looked like, that had an A-frame canopy. It was on page 217 of our packet, and I guess my question was, if one of the issues between staff and the applicant has to do with the A-frame, and if an A-frame is an approved Wawa design, could that not be substituted and eliminate that objection?
It certainly could be, Mr. Crop, but as we've explained, we feel like it's an inferior design. I mean, Wawa has been evolving since 1964, and its designs have evolved with it. And so, yes, if you look across the country and its footprint, you can find examples of just about anything in a Wawa parking lot, as Mr. Bell will attest, not all of which they're proud of, and they're trying to improve in their aesthetics, and it's our position. And this, just to be clear, and I think Jeb will endorse me, this is not this is our prototype, and this is all we do, and we're not changing for you, or it really is not that at all. They've proven themselves through some of the concessions I showed you to be amenable to trying to acclimate to, as long as they felt it was aesthetically appropriate to the standards that the county preferred, even for features that are not in the James City County. This was one where they just felt like the wing design was just a better design. It achieved a more attractive aesthetic. It's certainly your purview to disagree with us. We're not disrespectful of staff or your opinion. It's just we believe it's a better aesthetic, and and I think the best example of that is the picture I showed. I should have taken some pictures of some mansard or other canopies, but it's just a lower profile, a less visually obtrusive design. And
I was just
could we yield on that? Certainly, we don't think it's in the best interest of the aesthetics of the corridor and which creates value for our client as well as the community.
And then earlier, a few minutes ago, you alluded to the fact that you had thought that your landscape design on the James City County property in this parcel was in compliance with the enhanced landscaping that James City County requires. And Have you since received confirmation from staff that it actually is in compliance, or is there still an issue with the landscaping itself?
I don't think we've had a direct conversation, but I think you're only, I mean, Paul or Alex, please correct me. I think you're comfortable that what we've done in James City County meets your expectations in the county, that where they believe we fall short is in the elements of the plan that are in York County.
In York County only,
Yes,
okay.
sir. Yes, sir. Now, I hadn't asked that question specifically, but it just through the dialogue, which has been very cordial, by the way, that was my inference. So,
thank you.
Took my neck out. I'm glad it didn't get chopped off. Thank you.
I just had to do a little bit of math there. So the question was the relative increase or expected increase in total trips from the Wawa to the Exxon. The Exxon is currently has 10 fueling positions and a relatively small C-store. The proposed Wawa has 12 fueling positions and obviously a much more, much larger C-store element. So based on ITE trip generation rates, which are based on traffic counts that have been done at these C-stores all over the country, the Exxon has approximately 1,720 daily trips. That's the total of the ins plus the outs. And the Wawa would have 2,766 daily trips, which is an increase of roughly 1,000 daily trips. That's 500 in, 500 out over a 24-hour period. Partly due because there's 2 more fueling positions and partly due to the nicer store with more amenities and food and so forth.
Wawas are open 24 hours a day.
There's also, not that this will be of particular interest to you, but it was to the York County reviewing agencies. One of their requirements, which Wawa has agreed to comply with, is that there be this facility be generator ready, so that in times of emergency with loss of power, there's a condition that's proposed and that we've agreed to in the York County conditional use permit, the complementary or the corresponding permit in York County, that that the site design include that generator hookup and that we provide that standby power either on site or through a rental of a unit, a generator unit in times of natural disaster and loss of power, and also. I guess to one of the questions that maybe Mr. Holt raised or comments, which I think is quite legitimate about, the lack of the ability to control the transportation improvements in York County. If it's any comfort to you, the York County conditions that have been recommended for approval to their board do include, similar to yours in James City, that all those improvements be of our use permit.
When do you expect to know from VDOT whether they will grant the exception for Lightfoot Road?
They have already granted it.
It is being granted.
Yes, sir. VDOT has approved the traffic study, the supplemental analysis related to the signal coordination, and the access exception.
And, do you mind? So, just real quick, when I was looking at these conditions, there was a condition for JCSA. So are these utilities that come from James City County, or is it York County?
Call the JCSA condition, Paul, but I may have lost
it was about storm. It was about irrigation and
water conservation.
Water conservation.
Measures. Yes.
So it just made me think. I mean, is it? And just trying to understand what the financial impacts are on the county. So do utilities come from James City County or York, do we know, for this site?
The answer is I don't know who the water supplier is. The water connection is along the rear of the site, but I don't,
Okay.
given the proximity of these jurisdictions, I don't know whether it comes from York
And
or
because
JCSA.
this is all located, I know currently because the cash register is located in York County, the tax revenue is to the benefit of York County. Does that hold true for the fueling pumps as well? Or how does that all work?
Got two, it looks like.
I don't know the answer to that question, where the split of the sales tax reimbursement, how that gets apportioned. I just don't know. I'm sorry, Tim.
Guess we'll have to toss and do some coin tosses. That's interesting. Any other questions for Mr. Trent? All right, thank you, Mr. Trent. I don't have any other speaker cards. Would anyone else like to speak on this during this public hearing? Okay. All right, seeing and hearing none, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing and open it up for discussion. Yes, Mr. Alder.
Like everybody, I've been past this site a million times, and it's never drawn my attention until I got this application. And I drove past it the other day. I actually went in and sat in the parking lot for a little while, and I just think this is a much, much better use of this land than the current. That is to say, this Wawa is a much better visually, economically use for this than the present use. They already have a digital sign, as I mentioned. The landscaping isn't anywhere near as nice. The current landscaping isn't anywhere near as nice as the proposed landscaping. The Lightfoot exit is much better, moved farther away from the intersection. There's only one entrance on Richmond Road, which is an improvement. If we were considering this as a brand new building on a vacant lot, I might look at it differently, but I just think this is a much better, in all regards. The traffic is going to grow along here. I've made that point in earlier hearings. I'm glad I'm not going to be around in 2040 and have to drive on Richmond Road. But this isn't going to be a material, make it materially worse. So I plan to support it, and I plan to support it with the two changes proposed by the applicant, change number 5 and number 9, I believe. And
Thank you, Mr. Alderman.
Yes, that was one of my questions. First of all, I agree with Mr. Haldeman's assessment on the aesthetics. It's much better than the existing conditions. I do have some concerns that I'm still trying to work through on the 1,000 additional vehicle trips in and out per day on an already constrained roadway that has to deal with railroad crossings and with all the traffic exiting from the Lowe's and Home Depot area. I did have a question, though. The applicant proposed 3 changes. One had to do with the square footage, which I have no concern about. The other had to do with the bicycle accommodations, proposing a 10-foot multi-purpose path instead of the bike lane on Richmond Road, and then the gas pump canopy that they're proposing. And so my question for staff is, what's your reaction? We haven't heard since we received the amendments from the applicant whether this was acceptable or not, or any part of them were acceptable.
Sure. Mr. Croft. So the changes to the conditions for the Bikeways master plan, we would still recommend the assessment of or the board adopted Bikeways master plan and what that shows, which is the bicycle lane on the separate from the multi-use path, so still on Richmond Road frontage. Staff would also still recommend the condition for the architecture of the canopy that staff proposed.
About the square footage?
Definitely, I think we're...
Issues there.
Sorry, what was that?
No issues there.
Yeah, no issues with the square footage.
Thank you. Mr. Polster?
I would agree aesthetically, it's a big improvement over what's existing there. I know that there's nothing we can do about Richmond Road. It's already 4 lanes, and I don't know that it's going to get any bigger. But that Lightfoot Road is too, and I probably drive on the Lightfoot Road coming out of the Antique Mall, and which is way beyond the railroad tracks. And there are many times where I take a right-hand turn and go on 199 and forget about trying to get to Richmond Road or doing some business over there. I mean, it's just there. When I have gone in and taken that Lightfoot Road, I don't know how many times the right-hand lane fills up all the way across, and even though you're pushing it back, it fills up for the traffic flow. And so it isn't unusual to be more than 25 or more than 50 seconds for somebody to make that left-hand turn if somebody is willing to let them through. And given the light change in that right-hand turn on the Richmond Road going west, people are taking a right-hand turn on a red light, obviously if it's clear. So that right-hand turn moves rather quickly. So somebody trying to jockey themselves out on that left-hand turn, they have a problem. And it's already, underneath the current conditions, difficult, let alone increasing the load that we're talking about for that left-hand turn. So the only thing I can hope for is that the VDOT guys finally figure it out. For the long term, that's another issue and not their problem for it. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Polster. Mr. Leverance?
I agree with previous speakers that a Wawa would be a definite improvement on this parcel. My concern has to do with the aesthetics. James City County works very, very hard to preserve our community characters and our corridors. And for us, I see no compelling reason to relax those standards in this case. And I think it would be a disservice to the businesses across the street who have adhered to those standards. You know, for us to say, well, okay, we're just a tiny little piece of this, and so we're not going to make them do what we think is appropriate. I think it's very important for us to stick to our guns, particularly with the canopy. I mean, I agree with staff that an A-frame canopy is much more aesthetically pleasing than the big cantilevered one.
Thank you, Ms. Leverance. So I just want to add a few things. One is, could be completely wrong here, but we've got the net increase of 1,000 vehicles. But when you take into account the improvements on lengthening those turn lanes on both Lightfoot Road and over across the way on Richmond Road West, and the fact that before it was even said, I'm just assuming that most of the folks who are going to go to Wawa of the 1,000 are just already there and are now stopping. I'm suspect that it's really going to be that large of an increase to that intersection. On a completely different point, it was brought up here a few times tonight. Absolutely, the new apartments will be, but I don't see it. I don't think it'll be 1,000 more. I think they're already there for the most part. There'll be some new ones that go out of their way to get to Wawa. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the bicycle lane and see if I could play this off any of you guys. Our board has adopted the, just having your extra lane there right next to traffic, and riding with my kids and some of those around the Williamsburg area, we'd get up on the sidewalks because even though the bike lane's there, law of averages, we're going to do better on the sidewalks. So I don't really have any opposition to a 10-foot wide multi-purpose trail, and sort of fingers crossed that as we develop to the west that would continue because it's way safer. I know someone who lost a loved one as a pedestrian on Richmond Road recently. So I'm always a proponent of multi-purpose with a divide between the main road. And I guess I'll stop there. Do any of you all have any feelings on that? Yes, Mr. Crow.
And I have a similar reaction to you that, I think bicycle accommodations are very important in James City County, and we need to keep them. But I think maybe we need a little more flexibility based on the intensity of use of the roadway. And I actually thought that the proposed 10-foot multi-use path was a safer option than having a dedicated bicycle lane on Richmond Road. And I know initially there's the potential that someone will be up on the multi-use path, then they have to go onto Richmond Road. Then, but you know, the vision with any initiative, whether it be the multi-use path or just bike lanes in general or sidewalks, is that eventually they work their way down, and if it's a good idea, more and more people will incorporate them. So I do share your concern from a safety standpoint. And I do think that the 10-foot path is safer than the dedicated bike lane on Richmond Road.
Right, and York County has already, sounds like, approved their stretch, so it would sort of naturally blend as you wrap around, and hopefully, as we peer into the crystal ball, there'll be some pedestrian accommodation for those new apartments to the north, too, so I won't have to make as many vehicular trips. There was something else that I'm blanking right now. Anybody else have anything you wanted to discuss?
I would just say I share the sentiment that I think Wawa is the best improvement. However, with young drivers in my family, you know, although we're saying we're not adding to the total traffic volume, what we are adding is 1,000, you know, according to these numbers, you know, 1,050 turning movements every day. And that's the part that troubles me. And what troubles me is, you know, we just said no to another application further down the road because we didn't want them to make U-turns at the Croker intersection, because the only way to go west was we went east to go west, and then they redid their traffic plan to avoid creating that U-turn. So we've already heard that with no left turn into that off of Lightfoot, if you're northbound, you know, fortunately for my wife, I make 4 or 5 trips to Lowe's every weekend, working on house projects, and you know, it's just it's a terrible intersection. And I think if there's a train coming and you can't make a left turn out onto Lightfoot, we're forcing all that traffic out onto Richmond Road to then go down to Smith Memorial and make a U-turn to go back east, to either go 199 or go further into town. So while I appreciate the improvements and the desire to invest, you know, I'm not finding the benefit to James City County as far as what the county can expect to gain other than a bigger bottleneck at an intersection. So I'm not inclined to support it as it's submitted tonight.
Connor. Anyone else? So this could, anyone want to make a motion?
I'll give it a go. Need to get
Proposal for number 9, please. That may help, Mr.
I move we approve conceptual plan 18 dash, excuse me, I have the wrong one up. I have it here anyways. I'm sorry. I move we approve SUP 18-0030 as submitted with the multi-use path and with the canopy as submitted by the applicant.
And Mr. Haldeman, just to clarify, the applicant had also recommended a change to the degree it ends up becoming applicable on James City County side, just for consistency with the York County application, that change in the square footage of the store.
And with that included as well. Sorry, thank you.
So for the purposes of the record, let me reread back what I thought I heard the motion to be. Tim? I'm sorry, could you forward your, I don't have a mouse up here. Could you forward your slide 2 more to number? Mr. Haldeman made a motion to recommend approval to the Board of Supervisors with the conditions as listed in the staff report with 3 changes. Number 1, the change in square footage would go from 5,850 square feet to 6,500 square feet. Condition number 5 would be amended to include the reference to the mixed-use path, the 10-foot wide mixed-use path as shown on the master plan. And then condition number 9, Mr. Haldeman, you're recommending approval of as part of your motion as listed there on the screen?
Yes.
All right, we have a motion.
Reread that one more time, or is that? Okay. Ms. Leverins?
No.
Mr. Polster?
No.
Mr. Haldeman?
Yes.
Mr. O'Connor?
No.
Mr. Kropp?
No.
Ms. Dowdy?
No.
And Mr. Schmidt?
Yes.
Vote is 5-2. Motion did not carry. That will be the record.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Okay, now exiting the public hearing portion of the meeting, tonight's meeting, we move on to Planning Commission considerations.
Does anyone ask if they have any other motions? They could make other motions.
Any other motions? Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. Yeah, before we move on, anybody else want to make a motion?
And this would be for
what we just covered, for, if you want to make a motion with different,
A motion to approve
or a
it
different
without
motion.
the amended conditions.
Or
I
different
think
amended
is
conditions, yeah.
what the question is.
Yeah. Give it a couple seconds.
I have a suggestion if the vice chair would recognize me.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, Mr. Trent, you can go ahead, please.
And I obviously defer to the judgment of the commission, but based on listening and scribbling notes to the comments of the commissioners, perhaps approval of the amended conditions without the amendment to canopy condition that appease commissioners. Expect that and endeavor to work with staff between now and the board to find a compromise on the canopy.
Great, thank you, Mr. Trent.
My concern, the reason I voted the way I did, I personally had no problems with the amended conditions. My one sticking point, as I said during my comments, was the traffic impact. I see that intersection the way it is today, and I just felt like there's still that the additional 1,000 trips would be problematic, and so that was the reason behind my vote.
Right. Thank you, Mr. O'Connor.
And I voted the same way. The traffic patterns, and the canopy. To your point, we have beautification regulations, and I think we should be consistent.
Thank you, Ms. Dowdy. So, all right, well, anyone else? Looks like last chance for another motion. Okay, doesn't look like. All right, thank you. Thank you. All right. Moving on to the Planning Commission considerations. We have tonight C-18-0123, HRSD treatment plant expansion within Carter's Grove AFD. And, good evening again, Ms. Haynes.
Thank you again. Good evening, everybody. Hampton Road Sanitation District currently operates the Williamsburg Treatment Plant located at 300 Ron Springs Drive. This is a landlocked parcel that is wholly surrounded by 250 Ron Springs Drive and the Carters Grove AFD. HRSD has stated that it requires a facility expansion adjacent to the Williamsburg treatment plant. This expansion is in response to a federal enforcement action taken by the EPA and Department of Justice. HRSD has stated that there is insufficient property on their current parcel to accommodate the facility expansion and as such has stated its intent to acquire 250 Ron Springs Drive by condemnation for public utility purposes. HRSD is not requesting a withdrawal of the property from the AFD or any approvals for the facility itself at this time. Rather, per state code, utilities may acquire interest in properties within an AFD, provided that the Board of Supervisors, in consultation with the AFD Advisory Committee and Planning Commission, reviews the proposal and specifically examines the following 3 criteria: the effect the action would have upon the preservation and enhancement of agricultural and forestal resources within the district and associated policies, the necessity of the proposed action to provide service to the public in the most economical and practical manner, and whether reasonable alternatives to the proposed action are available that would minimize or avoid any adverse impacts within the district. Ultimately, the Board of Supervisors will make a determination as to whether the proposed action is necessary to provide service to the public in the most economical and practical manner, and whether it will have an unreasonably adverse effect upon state or local policy. In consideration of the state code criteria, HRSD has stated that they will reduce clearing impacts to approximately 7 acres and would not need to remove the entire parcel from the AFD. Undeveloped portions of the parcel and the resources therein would be preserved in the AFD and subject to AFD regulations. The proposed action is in response to a federal enforcement action taken against HRSD, and the proposed facilities would provide necessary service to the public by alleviating groundwater shortages in the Hampton Roads region. Given the landlocked nature of the HRSD parcel, staff finds there is no practical way to avoid action within the Carters Grove AFD if the project is to be completed in the most economical and practical manner possible. Should HRSD pursue a nearby non-contiguous parcel, they would still need an access and utility corridor through the subject parcel, and per HRSD's estimate, this would increase capital costs. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission find the proposal necessary to provide service to the public in the most economical and practical manner, and that it will not have an unreasonably adverse effect upon state or local policy. At its January 24th meeting, the AFD Advisory Committee voted 5-1-1 that the proposal is not necessary and would have an unreasonably adverse effect upon state or local policy. And at this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. And I believe reps from HRSD and Carters Grove are here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Haynes. Any questions?
Have there been any recent developments on the discussion of a conservation easement? We're talking right now that the parcel itself is 76 acres, probably 7 acres is what's needed for this enhanced facility, plus maybe a little bit more for a future expansion, but that still leaves the vast majority of the site, even though it's not, it's got a low percentage of its acreage that's developable. But I'm wondering, since the HRSD letter mentioned the possibility for a conservation easement, has anything been agreed to in that regard?
No, HRSD does not own the parcel at this time, so there's been no formal talks, but we do know that they stated an intention that they would be willing to put some of that land in a conservation easement.
Mr. Crop, members of the commission, just for clarity, I think those level details and that approach to the design would come as part of a later decision point, as Ms. Haynes mentioned, and I think some of the advice that the county attorney's office provided. Your analysis tonight and your recommendation forwarded to the board tonight would really focus around those 3 criteria. We're at a point in time in this process. Should this action move forward and should HRSD continue along their critical path, there would still need to be at a later date a request to withdraw property from the AFD. There would still be a separate request later on for a special use permit for the use of the site. And there would be some of these other legislative applications that would pull that master plan together, what the design was at that point. Those would come to you as future decision points, which is why you don't have that piece as part of.
And the reason for my question is I thought it was germane to the three elements that we're supposed to look at. And the first one in particular, the effect of acquisition would have upon the preservation and enhancement of agriculture and forestry and agricultural and forestall resources. And so I was looking at it from two standpoints. One, that as one of the evaluation criteria we're supposed to use, but then also from a historic landmark case of a big part of the Carter's Grove property includes the buffer area. And, you know, if that didn't have any constraints for conservation easement, and agricultural and forestall activities were not taking place if some alternative took place. That was the reason for my question.
Some additional information that came through that showed some of the extent of that resource protection area and some of those that came through earlier.
Mr. Altman.
I agree with Mr. Kropp's comments and would add one more. If they're buying 60-some acres more than they need to fulfill their mission, wouldn't that affect the economic efficiency of providing the service? You're adding expenses, considerable expenses, I would think. I don't know how much the property costs. But you'd be adding a lot of the cost beyond the cost necessary for the 7 acres. And that would go into the economic viability of the project. I would assume water rate payers would pay for that incremental expense.
If I can add on, I don't think right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a purchase. Right now, the application is strictly for condemnation of the 76 acres because the applicant and the HRSD have not reached any agreement on a sale price. Is that correct?
That's staff's understanding.
So it's a condemnation, eminent domain type of situation where HRSD is saying they're taking all 76 acres.
Can Mr. Halaban maybe clarify through the condemnation process, is there a market value that's attached to that 76 acres in the process, or?
Yes, there are a number of steps that a political subdivision or municipal corporation has to go through before they can use the power of condemnation. And the take, as it is, when it's judicially approved, has to have a valuation that is associated with that. So there are a lot of studies that go into what that total valuation is for what is being taken. So that's a process really separate from the consideration in front of the Planning Commission tonight as far as the recommendation for what the board will consider in making its final order, which is essentially, does the action of, I guess, HRSD purchasing or taking this 76 acres, does that have an effect on the district as a whole? This action doesn't actually remove the property from the AFD. That would be a separate process by statute. So it's really the action of the property becoming HRSD's for the purpose of them building on that 7 acres or whatever the process.
Yeah. I mean, my hang up is, you know, HRSD could choose to condemn a portion of 200 Ron Springs Drive. You know, it says it's an additional $1 million in capital costs, but not knowing the cost associated with the 76 acres, not knowing the cost of, you know, possibly condemning a smaller portion, it's hard to analyze that third option as to whether or not, for me, it's hard to analyze that third option if reasonable alternatives have been considered, because I'm correct, the 200 Ron Springs Road is not in the AFD, so that's where I kind of struggle with the concept.
I have a question on that, but I don't know if it's for the applicant or for the staff on exactly that issue. And it was in the documentation where there's been negotiation that's been going on, but they've not been able to ever make a site visit to determine which portion of the AFD they would use to build. And so they're up against this consent order that says, I think, what is it, by April, they have to either conform or not. And so what other choice did they have but to look at the condemnation if they couldn't find out what was something less of the 76 acres? Despite the fact that when you look at the attachment that they provided us, that better than 3/4 of that 76 acres is not developable or even put a site on. But I mean, the site that was there, they were never given an opportunity. So that, for me, kind of erased it. And then it got to the point where they would also have to have an easement to be able to get the Ron Springs with a sited plant. And because they couldn't even get the discussion to begin with, what would let them believe that they'd be able to get an easement across that property to get over to the other one? I mean, so they were kind of just lockstep. Now, if I got that wrong, I mean, that's what's led them to this thing.
Sound like an accurate summation?
I would defer. I'm not sure staff could respond to that.
The applicant could.
Ask the applicant.
Could I ask could I ask a related question that would have to do with an easement? Would an easement have to be negotiated, or could a piece of property required for the easement then be condemned? I'm looking at the parcel across Ron Springs Road and thinking that looks like a more developable piece of property. And I'm just wondering whether that property has been closely looked at, because I didn't see anything that really supported that $1 million.
Right, I'd defer to the applicant.
So,
okay.
So one moment before we do that, because this is not a public hearing, I just want to be careful and going forward and making sure that if we go that route, that other members of the audience we'd have to consider in the interest of fairness without a chance to talk. So Mr. Lavin, do you have?
I think you're correct. It's not a public hearing. It's within the Planning Commission's prerogative to ask questions of the applicant. And that doesn't make this consideration a public hearing. So I think it's totally within your prerogative to ask the applicant questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lavin. So it sounds like folks want to ask some questions of the applicant. So let's go ahead and let's.
And yes, Ms. Leverance, to your question, I'll let the applicant discuss the practicalities of their application itself. From a legal standpoint, condemnation you can acquire an easement by condemnation. It's any property right that you would need for the public purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Robin Hanson, and I am an attorney with the law firm of Jones, Bleckman, Wilson, Kelly in Newport News, Virginia, and we serve as counsel for Hampton Roads Sanitation District. I have with me the more expert on this, which is Lauren, and I'm going to butcher your last name, Lauren, Zaransky. All right, I think I said it right. But Lauren has much more expertise about the engineering aspects, et cetera. But as staff has told you, there are 3 things for you to consider today. And I am in a position to tell you that HRSD has looked seriously at the 24-acre parcel. However, the problem is HRSD is in a donut, and it's surrounded completely by the Carter's Grove AFD. To operate, and I'll defer to Lauren in just a minute, to develop the new facility and operate it, it has to work with the treatment plant that's already in the donut. So no matter what happens, the AFD is going to have to be impacted here some way or the other if HRSD is able to meet its obligations under the consent decree and construct this facility. But I think and so if you look at the 3 things, HRSD is committed, and it's said in its letter, we're going to develop as little as possible, but what is absolutely necessary. And as noted by staff, and as noted that much of this land is completely undevelopable anyway. HRSD is not going to try to go in; it's going to preserve it. It needs its decision to come before you. It needs an approval under the statute based on these criteria. Whether the whole parcel itself, HRSD would use it to protect its its operations to protect the shorelines, as they have noted, and it is the most economical in all of its analysis. HRSD has been looking at this for almost 2 years, and as it will save the ratepayers money to use it this way, according to what they've looked at. But I'll let Lauren Zavransky, there you go, address you and ask her questions.
Good evening, Commission. I appreciate your time this evening. Appreciate your consideration on this. I have my board, but I'm sure it's actually much easier to see it up there on the screen. So I appreciate your question about being able to designate pieces as part of the term at the moment, but being able to set it aside after we have a site plan set. And it really goes back to what I appreciate Mr. Polster is pointing out. Without having the ability to take the gray representative 7-acre plot, it's a compact square, it's to scale, and actually find where that could fit in and around our force mains that are shown here near the entrance, and be able to fit within the site or as close to the buildable area on the site. The idea is to come forward with more of an open-ended plan now within this parcel, so that the cost savings is really in not redoing design, not getting out there surveying and having to come back when the estimation that we put forth, I'd say a smaller piece if we came for you, was not purely buildable once we got out there and we were able to do surveys, geotech work, and actually be able to get on site and start working through there. If there was any issues that would rearrange or relocate our facilities, then we would be back here at the same place. This is really talking about practical and cost-efficient design moving forward. So we're looking to have the flexibility to lay out that site in the most economical manner with one action, and be able to put land in a preservation easement going forward once we had the best site layout that kept it closer to the facility. Robin referenced the fact that this facility, the new expansion pieces, will be run by the same staff 24 hours per day. It'll be the same facilities, and there'll be a large corridor between them, moving water from the existing advanced treatment works into the advanced water treatment works that would be new facilities. We're talking about moving 8 million gallons per day between both of those facilities, so it's not an insignificant piece of utility corridor that we would need to move between the existing facility and the proposed new facility.
I want to try to understand your map there. Is the pipes that you show there of Ron Springs that are in that black line, those are the intake, your lines coming into your plant?
Yep, these are current existing force mains. So we have the easement coming in through a long, I guess that's Log Cabin Road coming in, and there's also a force main coming in from this direction.
So the 50-foot easement that you currently have is where along that line?
So that easement is on top of those lines and around it. So that easement wouldn't be available for the new plans that we're working for.
Okay, and then there's also a pipeline, I guess, for a gas line going through here somewhere too? There's somebody else that's got or are you the only one?
I'm not aware off of our
so
site.
So it's that intake line there that we're talking about with a 50-foot easement on that thing. Now, I had an opportunity yesterday, as a matter of fact, to listen to some folks talk about subsidence, but they were talking about the Suffolk Research SWIFT facility that you have.
That's correct.
And so you have a developmental site that's operational where you're pumping 1 million gallons a day into the ground, shutting it off, extracting it, but you're also got all the wells, and then you got the physical plant itself. So what does that footprint look like? Is that the 7 acres that you're going to require?
So the facility in Suffolk is a research center and a public outreach facility. It is of a different character than what the full-scale facility will look like. So they're not directly equatable.
The processes are.
So yeah, the treatment processes themselves, but the intent in the research center was actually more of a flexible, so that we would be able to support all of our permitting and development going forward, but then be able to advance and make changes later on. These facilities here will look more similar to the clarifiers and the filters and the pieces that are a normal full-scale facility.
What I was trying to do is get some idea of what the size of your plant would look like if it's scaled up, and why the footprint and why the proximity of all the lines, the wells, and all the rest of it to, in fact, the processing, all that stuff has got to come from your existing plant, right?
Sure. If I could walk through a little bit of where you're going right here. So the influent lines here at the front end of the plant, we work through primary treatment and in through secondary treatment here. So all of the plant flow that comes into Williamsburg comes through here. There is some it's actually intermediate treatment that happens because the plant itself was built to support the development with Budweiser. So there's a unique character that happens at Williamsburg that's not representative of all HRSD treatment plants. After secondary treatment here, biological treatment in these rectangular tanks, there's secondary clarification here. This open piece of the site will be developed as part of the SWIFT project to provide equalization to feed the SWIFT advanced treatment facilities. After that, what we're looking to do is nest as close as we can into the influent part of the front end of the plant, the entry of the plant. Here there's some switchgear work, and there's already some force mains. We can't build on top of the force mains as existing. Otherwise, as you can see within the donut, there's really no other buildable land. These are all steep sloped areas. So we're looking at alternatives here, trying to avoid our influent force mains and nest it as close as we can there. So what we do is intercept the secondary clarifier flow. There'll be equalization here and pumping. It'll actually pump through a utility corridor, currently estimated to be able to somewhat come around the back end of the plant, or the front end of the plant over here, and be able to feed initially the same process flow that's at the research center. So if you're interested in it, go through it. But what that would do is provide the full treatment quality targets here, and we'd actually distribute it in through wells that would be located at different places throughout, primarily the existing plant, and then at least one or two that would be in the new parcel. So it would be more of a radial distribution of treated water into the recharge wells after that. Due to all of the control pieces, the automated control pieces within the treatment works, if at any point that the water was not meeting the target, it wouldn't continue. We'd actually divert it, and it would flow back into the plant, use the existing effluent disinfection, and then out through the existing outfall, which is down here, back on this end of out to the James River.
So the additional, was it $1 million in terms of increased cost if you had to put it across the other way, is in construction, operational? Those are the increased costs we're talking about. Is that an estimate? Not where the wells would be also, or the wells would have to be someplace else?
Go ahead. Well, you can go ahead and address it.
So the wells themselves, some of them would have to be relocated as well. Some of them we are going to keep on the plants the same way we're trying to keep the treatment works near. It's better, the better to keep them as close as we can. They cannot all be on the same site. There has to be some distribution because there's some mounding of water. They can't be within a certain range, somewhere in the 700 to 1,000 foot radius.
The last one on that configuration is, do you have something to be able to measure the subsidence at this area also? So that's an additional hole that you got to put into the ground?
There's monitoring wells that are associated. Those are not specifically looking at subsidence. There's an extensometer at the Nansemond facility in Suffolk because of a partnership with USGS. If USGS was interested in other locations, we're working on other research with them. The monitoring wells are just looking at water level in the aquifer.
So there's wells going in, wells coming out, and then monitoring. Okay.
The wells coming out are significantly smaller. We're talking a 6-inch well just for monitoring.
What's the approximate cost of the project itself?
So the construction cost at Williamsburg is about $120 million for the treatment works, and I think that includes the well recharge wells and monitoring wells.
So $1 million is less than 1% of the cost?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not really sure exactly where the $1 million reference was for the.
I thought it was in one of the.
It was in the staff report.
The $1 million reference was by Mr. Ted Hennepin, the general manager. Ted has looked into that. He currently is out of town on business for HRSD and couldn't. But it's looking at the security back and forth and having, because just as Lauren has explained to you tonight, the facilities have to work in tandem with one another. So that parcel of, even if you go over to the 24 acres, you still have to come back and forth. So we're still impacting the AFD, even if you talk about, well, it is gonna cost $1 million more. But that doesn't cost, the $1 million that was quoted there doesn't consider how much HRSD would have to pay for the 24 acres in a condemnation. So you're gonna add to that. That's just $1 million more in operational costs.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we were talking more about the expansion of the utilities between them. I think Robin's point was well put there, that it's not really $1 million of just that, of a total impact. I think where Ted's reference was across expanding.
It was $1 million in capital costs. I'm just trying to put it in perspective for us as to what, if it's $100 million project and it's $1 million additional in capital costs, it's a 1%.
But that's not really correct, because if you notice, Ted, I mean, it's 1%. You're correct on it.
I'm just talking about capital costs.
Right,
I'm not talking about
You're not
operational
talking about the cost of the land
and anything
because
else.
it's going to
Right.
add. There would be, I can't say it's only $1 million more to go to the 24 acres. That's way underestimating.
So I think your point is correct. You're talking about the impact to the construction cost of the facility is expanding the utility corridor. I think the point Robin and I are trying to put our arms around is the fact that I gave you the construction cost for the facility and putting the treatment works in the ground with the associated utilities. The overall program cost includes the negotiated terms for the condemnation, the value of the condemnation, and that $1 million is not reflective of the additional cost for land and coordination of all of that. So for comparative to the construction
From where
facility.
I'm sitting right now, if you condemn 76 acres or 24 acres, there's still going to be an additional cost associated with the condemnation procedure. So I was just asking for the capital cost itself.
And conceivably, 24 acres condemned could be less expensive than 76.
Probably not.
Because
the 24 acres is developable and the 76 is not completely developable.
there again, if we only need 7 acres and it looks like the 24 acres is pretty much fully developable, perhaps we wouldn't need all of it.
I think the concern is that we're currently not contiguous and not really able to go ahead and extend those condemnation ability.
It's pretty darn close to contiguous, and if you condemned a tiny little sliver right straight up Ron Springs Road, you're connected.
But if we did that, we still have to consider the AFD. So,
but it's this much of the AFD and not the whole donut.
Well, but we're not asking to remove it from the AFD. That's not what we're
I think the reason I asked this question to begin with is that you've been at this for 2 years.
Yes, sir.
Okay. You have tried to do some site surveying, and you haven't been able to do that because?
We don't own the land.
Okay, and you haven't been allowed to go and take a look at it. And you've been trying to get an easement or some kind of an arrangement with them, but they have refused to negotiate with you. Is that not true?
We have negotiated, we have talked, but we got to the point that we came to a stalemate and followed this.
And the consent order forces you by April to do something or whatever that's going to be. So you can't.
No, we're dealing with that would be dealing with the EPA.
Okay, so the point of the question is that you've been trying to do this, but you've now come down to the last resort because of this time crunch on the 29th of April. Is that not your?
I think it's a fair statement. We are pressed. HRSD has many projects it has to finish under this consent decree, and this is one of the major facilities that has to now in the process that has to be met. And yes, we are pushing up on deadlines, and that's why we filed this, because we had to move forward. We're not trying to act fast and loose. It was HRSD needs to move forward to meet its obligations under the consent decree. And their goal, again, is to preserve as much of the AFD as possible and construct on and disrupt as little as possible. We're not asking you tonight to remove the AFD. We're just asking you to look at those 3 criteria that you're supposed to look at and determine if the effect of the action what effect the action would have on the preservation and enhancement of the AFD. And it is interesting to note, we talked about the 24 acres. It's not in the AFD, but it hasn't been designated to be in the AFD. But we understand it's the same type of land. And should that owner have wanted to put it in the AFD, it could be in the AFD. But I understand. And secondly, you're looking at, so why does HRSD want the whole 76 acres? It's to ensure the safe operation of the plant, to serve as a buffer, and they would maintain it. It affords them the ability to protect the use of the public funds by maintaining the slopes and shorelines, and it provides full access to the critical infrastructure in the existing easement. And the second question is the necessity of the proposed action. It's to provide services in the most economical and practical manner. And having this land right here that's adjacent to it is the most economical and practical. HRSD has looked at this. We've been looking at it for years and have studied it. And it will also provide the necessary service to the public to alleviate the groundwater problems. And it must be adjacent. It has to work in tandem with the current facilities. And then third, the last question you have is, have we considered reasonable alternatives? We have considered and we've got to impact the AFD. We've got to have this land in order, not a reasonable. So that's what we ask you. That's we defer to you. I thank you for listening to me. If you have any more questions, Lauren's by far more of an expert on this than I am, but I'm just here to look at what I see is the legal aspect.
If I could ask, and what easements are currently in place? I mean, I see that the shore below the plant has been as revetments are, and I assume it's probably been armored. So are there?
There's no easement in that location, and that's part of the extended reason for the full parcel. The only easements that are in place across the parcel are up here over the force mains. Our outfall comes out through here. There was a time where the shoreline was starting to erode, but a previous owner, Carter's Grove was not the owner at the time, and honestly it predates me fairly significantly, that we made efforts, and I believe there was conversation with the owner at the time for us to foot the bill and go ahead and put those armaments there, but we were at the whim of the property owner at that time. So to protect our assets there, part of that, this full parcel pursuit is to be able to have control on what's going on down there at the shoreline, to be able to protect those assets, and also be able to make appropriate decision-making around the sloped areas of the property. It's just the opportunity to protect those assets and make the right decisions for them without being at the whim of the property owner. That may be helpful at some times and just may not be at others.
As background, I worked at Kings Mill, so I worked with HRSD at relocation of the force main through that area, which is your new influent line. So it's a 50-foot easement?
Correct.
Is that correct?
I'm going to say that it's correct because that's typically what our pursuit is for a force main. I'm not familiar with that project and the pursuit of it, but
I'm just talking for now for what the,
sure.
I'm not worried about Kings Mill, I'm just worried about this area that's going through the AFD. So what's the size of the supply lines to your wells that will put water into the ground to the SWIFT project?
So the wells themselves are about 24-inch. I'm thinking you're kind of in the range of about that size piping. probably in that larger size, above 24-inch. I don't remember exactly what each one of them is because the well field has been sent out tentatively. We haven't actually put the corridors in so that we're not engineering again and then re-engineering it. So we've been focusing on where those are, but we're in the 24-inch or larger pipe range. So Mike, if you don't mind me asking you a question back, the influent pipe that's over here, do you happen to remember the size of that force main?
I think it might have been 36.
I would assume it was something that was
so
large.
It was moving quite a bit.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
If I can ask one question against criteria 2, provide the service to the public in the most economical and practical manner possible, and I assume that means from a safety standpoint as well. I just have a question. I know you mentioned earlier in the discussion that there is a safety valve, if you will, that if the purity standards of the treated water being injected into the aquifer fall below minimal levels, it will be the inflow will be diverted. But I guess my question boils down to, have there been studies in areas that are using this technology? Have there been any adverse issues with the quality of the water in the aquifer that it's being injected into? And from a secondary standpoint, and I think Mr. Polster was getting at that with his subsidence question, are there any indications of surface land movement one way or the other as a result of injecting the treated water into the aquifers?
Can I answer your second question first? There's two pieces of information that we've seen over the 4 or 5 years or so studying the full program. You started somewhat of a feasibility study. And what has been in the area are 2 other extensometers that I'm aware of. So USGS has a fairly sensitive piece of equipment that's down to the millimeter level of ground movement. The facility that I'm more familiar with is the newer one that they put in our Suffolk facility. It's actually drilled down to 2,000 feet down to bedrock, and it's able to see minor movements of ground surface. So the first piece of evidence that we saw was actually more related to paper mill operation in Franklin. USGS actually lost or diverted funding from their extensometer operation, and actually with the stopping of the operation of the wells, they came back to an extensometer. They hadn't been monitoring it a long time and actually saw a huge rebound. It bent a piece of rod. If you come to our research center, we actually have the rod that shows that just from the lack of withdrawal and the groundwater recovering in that area, there was a rebound just from that piece of evidence. What we've seen more directly related to the recharge for the 1 MGD for the research center, that extensometer is a lot closer. And it's interesting to see, as we did some initial pulling water out of the ground to flush the well before we started recharging, we actually saw some subsidence and then saw the recovery as we started putting water back in. And now I'm talking millimeters. It's an interesting piece of equipment because it sees it as the ground surface enhancements significantly changed. No. But we're putting 1 MGD into a massive aquifer that goes, most up and down the Mid-Atlantic region. So hopefully to answer your question, we have seen some examples that it could impact land subsidence in a positive manner. You would actually see some rebound where you see that it would actually be distributed across the aquifer itself. So we have some examples of it, but we're only putting in 1 MGD at the time. This facility would be closer to an 8 MGD facility, and we would continue to monitor in Suffolk, and you can actually see it distributed across the different pieces of equipment. So hopefully that answers your second question. So your first question, there's not just 1 or 2, it's actually a full suite of critical control points, they're called. And there's individual sensors, online sensors, that are taking readings fairly continuously down to the capability of each individual sensor. And so each one of them is looking at a specific set of parameters. Any one of them can trip and actually divert the water. And so when we're talking diverting water, we're talking water that's already made its way partially through to drinking water quality, and it just goes back out the way that our advanced treated water in the facility, the typical wastewater you would see, would go back out. Regarding fully treated water, because only the fully treated water would make it to any of the recharge wells, there's numerous locations throughout the country that are doing similar advanced treatment of wastewater. California is doing a lot of it. Obviously, Orange County is one of the biggest ones that everyone is looking towards. Also, Florida. Florida is diverting all of their ocean outfalls, or I can't say all. There's a push in Florida to move away from ocean outfalls. They are doing similar type treatment and similar approach to groundwater, specifically deep aquifer recharge. So here in this area, Chesapeake is doing ASR where they're using it for storage, and they're pulling it right back out. The modeling that we've seen is that the water that we'd be putting in the ground really wouldn't be coming back out, and really the water itself wouldn't be moving far from the individual recharge sites as well. It's more about a pressure gradient that would really do the impact of changing or impacting ground subsidence and pressures in the aquifer itself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Well, I just want to make sure I kind of understand this piece on number 2 on the public benefit. Because when I read that, I'm trying to figure out writ large public, meaning James City County, or writ large, meaning the state of Virginia, at least the Eastern Virginia groundwater management area, which is everything east of 95. And so there was a legislative direction 2 years ago to establish this advisory committee. And out of that advisory committee, that took 2 years, it went back to the legislature, this Eastern Virginia Groundwater Management Advisory Council, is the SWIFT approach came out number 1. And it came out number 1 because, or why the legislature got into this thing was the drought that we had and the lack of water in other sides of the state, and that the only place that would probably come from an emergency were the aquifers. But what they found out was the use and the pressure of the aquifers were completely depleted, which, as you recall, James City County did what? It got a reduction in the amount of gallons, and all of our water comes out of the ground. It was reduced because of this subsidence and because of the depletion of the aquifer. So from a public point of view, for James City County, this $2 billion investment to try to put 120 million gallons of water back into the ground to increase the pressures for the subsidence, which we've seen evidence of, and all those other recommendations mean to me that that's a big damn thing for us in our future on that, if I understand what public benefit means. And so I think the piece for me that makes a whole lot of sense is if they're willing to either put a conservation or put it back in the AFD and only use the 7 acres they're going to use, the public benefit out of this thing is huge, especially for county, in terms of the growth that we have. And we're doing what? In the last 2 pieces I've heard out of the PSA, we said no because of groundwater drawbacks. So if that's a correct interpretation of that paragraph, I think it really meets it for me. I think if there's anything you guys want to add off of that EVGMA that you thought, I mean, was a subsidence, it was a recharging of the aquifer. I mean,
those are 2 of the important pieces. I mean, the other piece for HRSD is you're talking about efficient spending of ratepayer dollars, excuse me. And for our ratepayers, this is a really important strategy for effluent management.
There is another piece of that, though, that comes back to James City County. And that is the TMDL credits that you're going to get.
Correct.
That because we're part of your HRSD, those credits are part of us. And so from an economic point of view, those credits are actual dollars that can be sold. But that's an economic benefit to the county and to the public good. I mean.
Thank you. So thank you, Ms. Zaransky.
Zorvinsky.
Oh, jeez.
It's okay.
I know. Ms. Hanson, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
So, yeah, so a couple things. One is, even though this isn't a public hearing, I just want to disclose that I did speak to Mr. Trent about this when we were talking about the Wawa over the phone. I don't know if anybody else wants to make a disclosure.
I did also.
Okay.
As did I. He phoned me, but I didn't return it.
Okay.
Ditto.
All right, thank you. And then, I have to say that this is complicated. I don't know if any of us have fully wrapped our heads around this. To be candid, I'm not quite there, but I'm getting there. I mean, Mr. Polster makes some really good points. environmental plus seems to be there as well. I spent a lot of time as a kid fishing at that creek out there. I didn't eat any of the fish, but it's going to be potentially definitely a plus there, I think. The chief concern from my standpoint is probably largely coming out of my career background is that water, of course, we have to have water, and Mr. Polster, again, you made some good points. Arguably our sort of crown jewel here is our cultural resources. So I do have some concerns on the larger acreage and kind of starting to encroach a little bit more on Carter's Grove, where we have the early 1620s Virginia Company town, Woolston hometown. We have the Georgian structure, and we have some of the earliest, if not the earliest, or the first archaeologically discovered slave quarters there as well. So a little concerned about that. I guess I'd feel better about all this. I think we all would if there was a way to have more assurances about how it was going to all play out. But a lot of this is going to go down to go on to the Board of Supervisors. So I don't know. We're supposed to stick to A through C, but Mr. Kropp did point out to me before the meeting, the Virginia Code does not specify the scope of the Commission's review. So this is sort of an outlier. We haven't really had a case quite like this. We're rambling at this point, but Mr. Halden. Yeah.
What are we going asked to approve or recommend, or what's the verb?
We're asked to consider and with part of the review process for the board to ultimately make a decision whether or not this application meets the 3 criteria. The effect the action would have upon the preservation and enhancement, the necessity of the proposed action, and whether reasonable alternatives were considered. So it's not a...
Mr. Haldeman, unless Mr. Haldeman supplements this, I think if you refer to the staff recommendation on page 3 of the staff report, we've tried to bubble that up about whether or not the Commission finds the proposal necessary to provide service to the public in the most economical and practical manner, and that it would not have an unreasonable adverse effect upon state or local policy. Is staff's recommendation in the affirmative? The negative of that would, as you see, there would be the recommendation from the AFD Advisory Committee. That would be the control. To summarize those 3, that would be the recommendation that staff would recommend to the PC for the board.
Got another comment if we're still discussing. I mean, are we?
Let's keep.
In the last year that I've been on this board, I've looked at conceptual plans of property that was taken out of the AFD, and I've seen several other parcels taken out of the AFD for. So the 4-year time frame of placing something into the AFD doesn't say that you're not going to develop. And if I understand it correctly, this parcel is zoned low-density residential. So if we're interested in protecting this land, the AFD only gives you every 4 years for a renewal, and it can be pulled out and used for something else, as opposed to a conservation easement, which is something that has been mentioned. I know that's down on the ground, but if we're really interested in trying to preserve that historical buffer and that nature to that, it's better served, in my view, in a conservancy than it is an AFD, given the track record and the desirability for development of these properties that are there for. So for what that's worth.
I'm sorry, Mr. Trent, this is not a public hearing. Thank you, Mr. Bolster. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm really wrestling with the impact on the AFD. It looks to me like the majority of these 76 acres are never going to be developed because they can't be. So we've had some discussions about whether it should even be in an AFD if it can't be developed anyway. I mean, that's another whole subject for a whole different discussion. But Probably if the 20 or some portion of the 24 acres were used instead, there would be less disturbance to the AFD. But if it's only going to be 7 or 10 acres anyway, does that really make a difference? And if the rest of the property, the rest of the 76 acres is going to be set aside and preserved, I think I'm okay with this.
Thank you, Ms. Leverance.
Looking at it through a very narrow lens, I strictly from a land use issue with the AFD, the fact that regardless of who owns the property, any withdrawal from the AFD has to go through the legislative process, and so there's going to be the ability to say, well, yeah, if there's a request to withdraw for a specific purpose, we could say, well, that's not appropriate. You know, it bothers me from a personal standpoint that we're talking as all 76 acres. And I realize that this is a litigation issue between the landowner and HRSD and so on. It just seems like it could have come here with some sort of an agreement for less than 76 acres, but that's not within our purview. So personal feelings aside in that regard, my recommendation would be that this application does meet all 3 criteria that we're supposed to evaluate it against, and I would recommend support of this to the board, but
Thank you, Mr. Grout. Mr. Alderman, did you want to say something? No. Right, there are other mechanisms through.
I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to make the motion that conceptual plan 18-0123 HRSD's treatment plant expansion within Carter's Grove AFD, that the proposed action would not have an unreasonable adverse effect on the preservation and enhancement of agriculture and forestry and agriculture and forestry resources within the district and associated policies under the code, U.S. Code utilities may acquire it. Number 2, there is a necessity of the proposed action to provide services to the public in the most economical and practical manner. And number 3, there are no reasonable alternatives to the proposed action that available that would minimize or avoid any adverse impacts on agricultural and forestal resources within the district.
Motion.
Ms. Leverance.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
No.
Mr. Crop.
Aye.
Dowdy.
Aye.
And Mr. Schmidt.
No.
It's 5-2 motion.
All right, thank you. Now we have the planning director's report. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the commission. Other than what's been printed and included in your agenda packets, I don't have anything new or additional to add tonight, but should you have any questions, I'm certainly available.
Paul, we do need to do the, okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm on it. All right, doesn't look like we have any questions for Mr. Holt. So now we're moving into planning commission discussion and requests. And one thing what Mr. Lavin was about to suggest is we need to, due to Mr. Richardson leaving, we've got to do elections for our officers. So.
Mr. Vice Chairman, if you will allow me, I'll kick it off in a manner that's more reflective of Max's fine articulation of the current issue than I tried to do earlier today. That's what I get for trying to email something out in 5 minutes. So if you didn't read it, I never said it. You just hit delete tomorrow and it'll be just as well. But pursuant to the Planning Commission's adopted bylaws, Article 3, Section 6, as Mr. Schmidt mentioned, when we have a vacancy that occurs for the chair or vice chair, which happened at the last meeting, an election shall be held on the next regular meeting date, which is tonight. So you're in need of a chair, and again, should the current vice chair be nominated and elected for that, then we would need to have a vacancy for the vice chair filled. So there would need to be a formal election per the bylaws, so there would need to be a nomination and then a vote.
Just a question. This term in office is really just through March, right?
Yes, another one of my typos earlier. So you're still going to have your regular organizational meeting in March, and so this would fill that term for February and March. And then your normal cycle kicks back in. Yes, it's a very short-term assignment.
Right, we'll be electing officers at I think it's the Monday, March 18th meeting for the following 12 months.
Or Chairman, I nominate Danny Schmidt.
Or Chair.
I'll second that.
Third it.
Other nominations?
Well, I'd like to come back at you and nominate. We need to do it right between. Okay.
Unless there's going to be more
Another
than one. We
nomination.
could do it together unless there's going to be more
Okay.
than one
Right.
nomination. So, you want to do a straw poll vote, and then you can.
I assume you're willing to do it. You did a fine job today.
Well, 2 meetings. Okay, I got it. Okay, so if we can do it together, okay, go ahead. I would like to nominate Mr. Haldeman for vice chair.
Second that.
Thank you.
Before we close, are there any other nominations? That way I know any competing nominations on the floor. Hearing and seeing none. There's only one, so we could do a voice vote. Nomination on the floor are for Schmidt for chair and Mr. Haldeman for vice chair.
But we're going to vote for ourselves then. I guess that's
Yeah,
awkward.
which is very fine. So
Okay.
you can do since there's only one, there's no competing vote. You can just do a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries.
All right.
Enjoy that pay raise.
Congratulations.
Really? Okay, and then does any other discussion? While I'm thinking about it, I just want to add too that it'll be, I guess, as we go into our organizational meeting, where right before that we'll be discussing committees, who's serving on which committees, and also who will have Board of Supervisors coverage and when, and we are covered through March, so the new cycle of that will start out in April. Okay.
As we get into the comp plan, I thought tonight's case was pretty poignant as far as if you look through the traffic study for the Wawa, it talked about the difference between, it called the Wawa a super convenience store. So perhaps we need to look at our ordinance to see what the difference is of a traditional convenience store versus a super convenience store, because, there seems to be a big difference when you're going from the small footprint that we saw to the much larger footprint today. And as we look at infill parcels and the like, I think it would really have a significant impact on what we're doing here in the next few years. Something to consider.
As we're talking about the comp plan, and because we have this partnership that is currently going on for the traffic study between York, Williamsburg, and James City County, I would hope that the planning staff would be able to talk about that Lightfoot Road and to see if there are some improvements that we may be able to make and make that an agenda item, at least so that when we start to do the comp plan, we could look at whether or not there needs to be some traffic improvements on either side for it, because it's just going to get worse. And it's a 2-lane highway, and it's going to be developed.
Application completely unrelated to that conversation. It's just such an interesting dilemma with that bottleneck there with the railroad. It's the same dilemma I think a lot of folks experience there on Airport Road, trying to get across there. There's only so much room. You almost envision a hourglass with the sand coming through a very tiny thing, because it's really, to be able to widen that out, you need that additional right-of-way road track. And kind of anywhere there's an at-grade crossing, you're going to have the exact same issue there in terms of building and additional capacity.
Anybody saw Airport Road a few weeks ago?
Oh, yeah.
A low boy tried to cross it.
I was caught.
and-
I got caught in it.
And, what's that?
Happens
There
a
were
lot.
three tow trucks there to pull that thing
Take 'em
off.
Yeah.
I've seen that before
Yeah.
as well, a couple of years
Yeah.
ago.
I got lucky. The copper waved me through, but I saw that and got,
You know, fortunately, Bypass Road was thinking ahead. I mean, it could be worse.
And I would encourage too, just as a separate point, Mr. Holt, if in conversations with VDOT, they could be encouraged to, you know, it was a requirement of Lightfoot Marketplace for them to install that controller. They did. It would be nice to see it hooked up, because that's, that intersection just gets worse with everybody trying to get across it, so.
They're digging in the meetings. They were digging in the meeting today.
I think that's a stormwater project they're working
They
on.
were going pretty deep.
So. I'll stop. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Any other discussion items? What I do? All in favor of adjournment?
Aye.
Aye. All right, thank you. And gavel. All right.